What happens when the only person who can save you is the one nobody ever noticed? 3 armed men, 1 bank, 27 hostages, and an ordinary-looking guy sitting quietly in the corner, nobody knowing that beneath the faded t-shirt and tired eyes is a former U.S. Navy SEAL who walked away from war to raise his daughter alone. When the guns come out, he doesn't run. He doesn't scream. He just watches and starts planning. If you want to know whether everyone makes it out alive, stay until the end, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Mason Hale walked into First Meridian Bank on a Tuesday in October, he was thinking about chicken nuggets. Specifically, he was trying to remember whether Lily had eaten the ones he'd packed in her lunchbox, or whether she'd traded them again for somebody else's fruit roll-up, which she wasn't supposed to have because the red dye gave her headaches. He'd told her teacher, he'd written it on the form. And still, every other week, Lily came home wired and squinting, claiming she didn't know where the headache came from. 7 years old and already a better liar than half the guys Mason had served with. He pulled a number from the ticket dispenser near the door, 43, and found a seat along the far wall, the one that put his back to solid plaster and gave him a clean line of sight to the entrance, the teller windows, and the hallway leading toward the back offices. Old habit. The kind you don't unlearn. The bank was busier than he expected for a Tuesday morning. A dozen people ahead of him in the unofficial queue that formed along the velvet rope, another handful already seated in the waiting area. A young woman in scrubs scrolling her phone, an elderly man in a too-big blazer cradling a manila envelope in his lap, like it contained something irreplaceable, 2 college-aged kids whispering to each other near the loan officer's desk. Mason checked his watch. 9:47 a.m. He needed to transfer $4,200 to Clearwater Academy's tuition account before the end of business Friday, or Lily lost her spot in the spring semester. He'd already called twice to ask for an extension. The woman in the financial office, politely, firmly, had told him there were 12 families on the wait list. $4,200. He had it. Barely. 3 months of overnight security shifts at the warehouse complex on Route 9, plus what was left from selling his truck and downgrading to a 10-year-old Civic that smelled like old coffee and made a clicking sound when he turned left. He had the money. He just needed 30 minutes and a functioning teller window. He leaned back in the plastic chair and rubbed the back of his neck. On the other side of the lobby, the glass entrance doors swung open and a woman walked in like she'd practiced it. Not in a showy way, more like someone who simply moved through the world with the assumption that it would make room for her. She was maybe 30, wearing a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse, dark hair pulled back with the kind of effortless precision that probably took considerable effort. She went straight to the reception desk without taking a number, said something low and direct to the young man behind it, and was immediately directed toward a private office hallway. Mason watched her for about 2 seconds, then looked back down at his phone. He had a voicemail from his sister, Carla, which he hadn't returned in 4 days. He had a text from the school asking if he was bringing anything to the fall potluck on Thursday. He wasn't, because he'd forgotten, and now it was too late to sign up for anything good, so he'd probably show up with a bag of store-bought rolls and hope nobody noticed. He had a reminder from the pediatrician about Lily's flu shot, which she was going to scream about, and a notification from his bank showing a balance that made his stomach clench, even though he'd been staring at that number for weeks. He put the phone away. The bank hummed around him. The AC ran too cold, the way banks always did. Someone's perfume, something floral and heavy, drifted across from the row of chairs nearest the window. The teller windows were moving slowly, the way they always moved slowly, with long pauses between customers while someone typed something, or went to find a supervisor or consulted a manual that probably hadn't been updated since 2009. Mason exhaled. He was thinking about whether to text Carla back or just call her tonight when the doors opened again. He didn't look up right away. Doors open. That's what doors do. But something made him look. Some frequency below conscious thought. The same thing that used to make him tense up 2 seconds before something went wrong downrange. A shift in the air, maybe. A sound that was almost right, but not quite. 3 men came in fast. Not running. Running draws attention before you're ready. They came in walking quickly, the way people walk when they're late for an appointment, and for exactly 1 second, they looked completely ordinary. Then Mason saw the bag under the first one's arm, long, cylindrical, the zipper not fully closed, and the way the second one's right hand stayed pressed flat against his thigh even as he moved, and the third one, the one who stayed near the door, turning his back to the lobby to face the entrance glass. Mason's body didn't move. His heartbeat dropped, not spiked. That was the thing people never understood about training, the real kind, the kind that gets ground into you over years. It didn't make you fearless. It made you functional. Fear was still there. It just moved to a back room and waited. He clocked the exits in under 3 seconds. Main entrance, covered by the third man. Side door near the hallway to the offices. 40 feet, 2 blind corners, a keypad lock he didn't know the code for. Emergency exit at the rear, tirage past the teller stations through a door marked Employees Only. Fire door, probably alarmed, definitely heavy. He counted the people in the lobby. 24 visible. 2 more voices coming from the back office hallway. The receptionist who'd directed the woman in the blazer, probably, and whoever else. A teller who'd stepped away from her window. Call it 27 total, give or take. He was still making these calculations when the first man reached into the bag and pulled out a shotgun, and the world changed. Everybody down, on the floor, now! The scream hit the lobby like a physical thing. For a half-second, nobody moved. The collective human response to sudden violence, that fractured moment where the brain refuses to accept what the eyes are reporting. Then the woman in scrubs dropped out of her chair. The elderly man clutched his envelope and slid sideways. The college kids grabbed each other. Someone near the teller windows made a sound that wasn't quite a scream, just a high, compressed note of terror. Mason got out of his chair calmly, put one hand on the arm of the woman sitting next to him, middle-aged, glasses, freezing in place, and said very quietly, "Slow. Get down slow. Don't make any sudden moves." Then he lowered himself to the floor the same way, deliberately, keeping his eyes moving. The second robber had vaulted the teller counter. Mason could hear him screaming at the bank employees to get away from any buttons, away from the phones, hands where he could see them. The third man, the door guard, had pulled what looked like a semi-automatic pistol and was watching the room while his leader continued to shout. The leader was good at this, Mason noticed. Not panicked, loud but controlled, the volume calculated for compliance rather than chaos. The shotgun moved in a deliberate arc, covering the room in sweeps, never pointing at one person long enough to invite a hero moment. He was wearing a black balaclava, gloves, and a hooded jacket 2 sizes too big. The other 2 wore similar, pre-planned, coordinated. These weren't amateurs. Mason lay flat on the floor, cheek 2 inches from the carpet that smelled like cleaning solution and old shoes, and he thought, okay, who are you and what do you actually want? Because that was the only question that mattered right now. Robbery was the obvious answer, but robbery was also the surface. What did they plan to do with 27 people once they had the money? The math of it, witnesses, complications, loose ends, was the part that made these situations go from bad to catastrophic. He needed to read them faster than they could escalate. The leader, Mason had already started calling him Anvil in his head, for the weight of the man's movements, deliberate and heavy. Walked the room in a slow circuit, stepping over people where they lay, counting heads, not looking for something specific, establishing control. Letting the silence after the initial explosion of noise do its work on people's nerves. Phones, Anvil said, not yelling anymore. Conversational, almost. Every phone in this room goes in the bag. You throw it, you slide it, you don't stand up. Anyone I catch holding one after the next 30 seconds, I'm going to make an example out of you in front of everyone here. Clear? A ripple of movement as people fumbled for their devices. Mason slid his out slowly, set it on the carpet, and pushed it a few feet forward with the tips of his fingers. He'd already turned off the screen so the battery meter wasn't visible. He made note of the time he'd last checked it, 9:51. Across the room, he could see the door to the private office hallway standing partially open. Through the gap, he could see the edge of the woman in the blazer. She was pressed against the inner wall, out of the lobby's line of sight, and she appeared to be completely still. She'd seen the same thing he had, maybe 2 seconds earlier. Smart enough not to run back into the lobby. Smart enough to stay put. Whether she was smart enough to stay quiet was another question. Anvil reached the teller counter and leaned over it to look at the employees crouched behind it. 3 women and 1 man, all on the floor, hands visible. The second robber, Mason was calling him Wire, based on the lean, angular way he moved, had already begun working on the cash drawers, moving with practiced efficiency. "Which one of you is the branch manager?" Anvil asked. Silence. Then a hand went up, slow and trembling. One of the women, 50s, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. "Come around here," Anvil said, gesturing with the shotgun toward the hinged gate at the end of the teller counter. "Just you, slow." The manager, her name tag read Patricia, in gold letters on a little rectangular pin, stood on shaking legs and walked around the counter. Her hands were raised to shoulder height, palms out, like she'd practiced for exactly this situation and was now discovering that practicing had prepared her for almost nothing. Mason watched the transaction carefully. Anvil wasn't rough with her. Not yet. He pointed her toward the manager's office off the side hall with a gesture that was almost professional. That meant he wanted access to the vault or the cash reserve, probably both. That meant this was going to take longer than a simple till grab. Longer was good. Longer gave him time. He shifted his weight incrementally, turning his head a fraction of an inch to see more of the room. The door guard, the third one, who he was calling Ghost, because the man had barely spoken and kept moving in slow drifts along the perimeter, pistol loose in his hand, was watching the hostages in the main area. Professional spacing. He didn't crowd them, but kept himself positioned where he could see everyone without anyone being able to approach him from behind. Ghost was going to be the hard one. Mason's left hand, pressed flat against the carpet, touched the leg of a plastic chair that someone had knocked sideways when they dropped. He didn't move it. He just noted it. 3 feet of hollow aluminum tubing. Not ideal, but not nothing. He spent the next several minutes being completely still and paying attention. From what he could hear, the vault access required Patricia's keycard and a secondary code that she claimed she didn't have, which was likely a lie, and which Anvil was letting ride for the moment while Wire finished with the cash drawers. The take from the tellers was probably somewhere between 30 and 60,000, Mason guessed. Enough to matter, but not what they'd come for. The way they'd organized themselves, the level of coordination, the patience of the leader, this felt like a crew that had a bigger number in mind. Secondary vault. He'd heard that phrase mentioned once, in a quick, clipped exchange between Anvil and Wire when they thought the room was too frightened to listen. Mason had been listening since the moment they walked through the door. He became aware, gradually, that someone near him was crying, not loudly, controlled, suppressed, the kind of crying that sounds like a person trying very hard not to cry and failing in small increments. He turned his head carefully and saw the young woman in scrubs, maybe 10 feet away, lying on her stomach with her face turned sideways. She was maybe 25. Her hands were shaking against the carpet. He caught her eye. He didn't say anything. He just held her gaze and made one deliberate, slow movement, pressing his hand flat against the carpet, steady, stable, planting himself. The gesture a diver makes on the pool wall, solid, still. Here. She stared at him for a moment, then, very slightly, her shaking slowed. It wasn't bravery, it wasn't training, it was just, people need to borrow calm from somewhere when they don't have any left. He'd given it away like that 100 times, in darker places than this. The private office hallway door opened wider and the woman in the blazer walked back into the lobby. She wasn't coming voluntarily. Ghost was behind her, one hand on her shoulder, steering her with the casual authority of someone who'd grabbed people before. He walked her to the center of the lobby floor and stopped. "Sit," he said. She sat, cross-legged on the carpet, back straight, jaw set in a way that suggested she was managing something enormous through sheer force of structural integrity. Her eyes moved once, fast, across the room, reading it the way people in boardrooms read a room when they walk in, cataloging, calculating. Her gaze stopped on Mason. He looked back at her, expression neutral. She looked away. Ghost said something into a small radio on his collar, too low for Mason to catch the words, and then resumed his circuit. But Mason had noted the exchange. Radio contact with someone external. That meant a driver, minimum. Could mean a lookout, a fourth man, a whole other layer of organization outside the building. He filed it away. The minutes stretched. The room had settled into the particular awful stillness of a hostage situation mid-development. Everyone on the floor, everyone afraid, nobody yet understanding how this was going to resolve. Children know that waiting is the hardest part. Adults forget and have to learn it again in the worst possible classrooms. Mason had not forgotten. He moved his right hand slowly across the carpet, an inch at a time, until it reached the leg of the fallen chair. He gripped it once, feeling the weight and the hollow reverberation. Then he let it go and moved his hand back. Just mapping, just keeping his options updated. Anvil came back from the manager's office. His body language had changed, tighter now, a specific kind of frustration that Mason recognized as the tension between what someone planned and what the world was actually offering them. He crossed to the center of the lobby and looked at the hostages on the floor. "I need everyone to understand something," he said. He was using the controlled voice again, calm and enormous, filling the room without echoing. "Nobody here is going to get hurt if everyone cooperates. I know you've heard that before. I know you think it's something people say, but I want you to understand I mean it exactly the way it sounds. This is a transaction. You let us complete it, you go home." He let that sit for a moment. "What makes it complicated," he continued, "is when people decide they're smarter than the situation." His eyes settled on the woman in the blazer. She didn't flinch. She met his gaze directly, which Mason noted and quietly respected, even as he understood it might be about to cause a problem. "You," Anvil said, "you came in for something, a meeting. With who?" "A financial consultant," she said. Her voice was steady, with the very slight controlled elevation of someone choosing their tone with precision. "Regarding an acquisition." "An acquisition?" Anvil tilted his head. "Big money?" "Corporate. Yes." "You have identification?" She reached slowly into her blazer pocket and produced a card holder. She held it up. He took it from her hand, looked at it, showed it to Wire, who had come around from behind the counter. "Evelyn Carter," Anvil read. "CEO, Helix Capital Group." He looked at her. "You're worth something." "I'm worth considerably more alive and cooperative than the alternative," she said. Wire made a sound that might have been a laugh. Anvil handed the card holder back to her. He was thinking. Mason could see it. The micro-adjustments of a man whose plan had hit a variable and was recalculating. Evelyn Carter, CEO of whatever Helix Capital was an asset he hadn't expected. A bargaining chip, maybe a lever for something. That made her more dangerous to be than she understood. Mason opened his mouth. He wasn't sure what he was going to say until he said it. "There's a secondary vault," Mason said. The entire room went still in a different way than it had been still before. Anvil turned his head and looked at him. Ghost stopped moving. Wire, behind the counter, straightened up. "Say that again," Anvil said. Mason pushed himself up onto one knee slowly, hands visible, making no sudden movement. He kept his voice flat and informational, the way you speak when you don't want to sound like a threat. "There's a secondary vault in this building," he said. "Sub-level, behind the mechanical room, past the employee break room. Most branch employees don't know about it. It's for high-value document storage, bearer bonds, estate papers, private client holdings. It's not on any of the public layouts." Anvil stared at him. "How do you know that?" "I did security installation for this building 4 years ago," Mason said. It was a lie. A clean, specific, detailed lie. The kind that sounds like truth because it has friction in it, because it doesn't come out smooth. "The contractor I worked for did the camera system in the secondary door hardware. I ran the wiring to that room personally. It was convincing because it was boring. People lie in dramatic ways. True stories have tedium in them." Anvil crossed the lobby toward him in 6 steps and stood over him, shotgun angled down. Up close, the man was bigger than he'd read from a distance. Solid through the shoulders, the eyes above the balaclava were dark and steady. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. Mason looked at him. "Because I have a daughter. and I want to go home. The truth of the second part was the thing that made the first part land. Anvil held his gaze for a long moment. Then he looked up at Ghost and jerked his head toward the teller area, gesturing him to cover the room. He reached down and grabbed Mason by the upper arm, grip strong, practiced, and pulled him to his feet. "Show me," Anvil said. "I'll need a light," Mason said. "The sublevel has no ceiling fixtures, just utility lamps on the walls, and they don't work without a key." Anvil reached into his jacket and produced a flashlight. He handed it over without hesitation, which told Mason the man wasn't afraid of him, which was either confidence or a mistake, probably both. Wire came around the counter, and now it was two of them. Anvil with the shotgun and Wire with a handgun holstered on his hip, walking Mason toward the employee corridor while Ghost stayed in the lobby. Mason moved toward the hallway door. As he passed the spot where Evelyn sat cross-legged on the lobby floor, he looked down at her for exactly 1 second. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. But he watched her register something in his face, a calculation, and he saw her eyes change. Not fear, not hope. Something more precise than either. She was reading him. Good, Mason thought. Pay attention. Then he pushed through the door into the employee corridor, and the lobby disappeared behind him. The hallway was narrow and fluorescent lit, the ceiling lower here, lined with filing cabinets and stacked boxes. A break room on the left, small table, coffee machine, a refrigerator covered in takeout menus held by sad little magnets. Past it, a door marked maintenance/no entry. "Through there?" Wire asked. "Through there," Mason said. He walked toward the maintenance door, working through the next 30 seconds with the same attention he used to give approach plans. 2 armed men, enclosed space, limited sightlines from the lobby, no external visibility. The emergency panel he'd noticed on the wall near the fire door, standard commercial building system, red housing, white pull handle, was 15 feet back the way they'd come. He had one play, and he needed to be in exactly the right spot to make it. "Wait," he said. "Why?" Anvil said, instantly suspicious. Mason pointed toward a panel on the wall to his left. A standard electrical conduit box, gray metal, nothing special. The secondary vault has an independent power circuit. If this box isn't isolated first, the motion detectors inside trigger an internal lockdown when the door opens. You won't be able to get in. This was entirely fabricated, but it was fabricated in the specific language of systems and protocols, which sounds authoritative even to people who know nothing about systems and protocols. Anvil hesitated, looked at the box, looked at Mason. "Open it," he said. Mason reached for the panel, using the movement, the natural blocking of his own body, the flashlight creating a visual focus point, to turn his hips toward the wall. His right shoulder was now 3 feet from the emergency alarm pull station he'd been tracking since they entered the corridor. He flipped the conduit panel open. Inside, a series of breakers, completely standard, nothing that touched any vault system. He began pointing at specific breakers with the flashlight, narrating in a low, technical-sounding monologue. "Main power here. Secondary circuit feeds through the eastern junction. You'll want to isolate the 3rd and 5th breaker in sequence because if you just kill the main, it trips the backup." Wire leaned forward to look. Anvil stepped slightly to the right to get an angle. Mason let the flashlight drift to the left. Both men's eyes followed it for 1 fraction of a second. Mason's right hand closed on the alarm pull handle and yanked it down hard. The noise was enormous, immediate and without warning. A pulsing alarm horn that seemed to come from inside the walls, from the floor, from every surface at once. Emergency lighting kicked on in the corridor, red-tinted, casting everything in shadow and arterial color. Anvil reacted instantly, swinging the shotgun up, but the hallway was narrow and Mason was already moving, not away, toward him, inside the arc of the weapon, the place where a long gun has no leverage. He drove his shoulder into Anvil's chest and hit the wall, pinning the shotgun arm, using the wall as the 3rd point of the triangle. The weapon discharged, deafening, plaster exploding, but the muzzle was pointed at the ceiling. Wire was coming around. Mason released Anvil, let the man's momentum carry him sideways, and turned to Wire in the same motion. Wire had the handgun up, but hesitated. The hallway, the alarm, the chaos, the sudden reversal of everything. And half a second of hesitation is an enormous amount of time when you're operating on the other end of the equation. Mason moved inside his arm, controlled the gun hand at the wrist with both hands, twisted the weapon up and out. The mechanics of it were simple and brutal and over in less than 2 seconds. The gun came free. He stepped back. Anvil was coming off the wall. Mason hit him once, economically, with the flat of the recovered handgun against the man's temple. Not the barrel, the flat. Hard enough to drop him without killing him, which was a distinction Mason had made consciously in the portion of a second available to him. Anvil sat down on the hallway floor and stayed there. Wire looked at Mason. At the gun? At his unconscious partner. Don't, Mason said. Wire didn't. In the lobby, beyond the closed hallway door, he could hear Ghost shouting. The alarm had changed everything in there, too. And then, underneath all of it, a sound he'd been waiting for. The percussion of boots on pavement outside, the crackle of police radio, the metallic clatter of a tactical team breaching position. He'd activated the emergency system. He'd left the conduit panel open with 3 breakers deliberately tripped, the pattern he'd arranged while he was narrating to the 2 men, which he'd specifically chosen because it corresponded to the sequence a responding officer trained in commercial building systems would recognize as a deliberate signal. He didn't know if anyone would recognize it. It was a long shot, but long shots were still shots. He secured Wire's hands with his own belt, quick, improvised, tight, and leaned him against the wall. He looked at Anvil, confirmed he was breathing, and left him where he was. Then he stood in the red emergency light of the hallway and waited for what came next. Through the door, he heard Ghost yell something unintelligible, then a crash, then silence of a different kind, the specific silence that precedes a tactical breach, when everybody on both sides holds their breath at the same time. Then the front doors of First Meridian Bank came off their hinges in a controlled explosion, and the police tactical unit came through. Mason set the recovered handgun on the floor, kicked it to the wall, and raised both hands. It took 11 minutes to secure the building. Ghost, alone in the lobby with 27 hostages and an alarm he hadn't expected, had made a calculation, the right one, as it turned out, and surrendered without firing. The tactical team found Mason in the hallway, exactly where he'd said he'd be. In 2 radio transmissions he'd managed through a wall-mounted intercom he'd located while Anvil was watching Wire flip through the cash drawers. A detail nobody had noticed. A detail he'd noticed immediately. He sat on the curb outside, a silver emergency blanket over his shoulders that he didn't need, a paper cup of bad coffee in his hand that he did need, and he watched the building get processed. Ambulances for the people with anxiety attacks, and one teller who'd hyperventilated. The manager, Patricia, sitting in the back of a paramedic unit with her hands wrapped around a bottle of water, looking at nothing. The college kids talking to each other in a rapid, adrenaline-bright exchange, already half converting it into a story they'd tell for years. The detective who interviewed him was named Reyes, 40-something, a methodical man who asked his questions in a particular order and wrote everything down in a physical notebook. He asked Mason to go through the sequence twice, then a third time from a different angle, and Mason answered everything plainly and left out the parts that didn't need to be there. The alarm, Reyes said, the breaker pattern. I used to do security installation, Mason said. I know commercial systems. Reyes looked at him. Most people would have stayed on the floor. Most people, Mason said. Reyes wrote something down. You have military background? Some. Reyes looked at him again, didn't push. Made another note. Across the scene, past the police tape, and the cluster of news vans that had materialized with the speed that media always materializes at events like this, like they're already circling, just waiting. Mason saw Evelyn Carter standing with a different detective, a younger one, giving her account. She was still composed. Her blazer was slightly dusty along one side from the floor, but otherwise she looked like someone who'd stepped out of a difficult meeting rather than a hostage crisis. She said something to the detective. The detective nodded. Then she looked across the parking lot and found Mason sitting on the curb. He lifted his coffee cup in a small, flat acknowledgement. Not a salute, not a smile. She looked at him for a moment. The expression on her face was the particular expression of someone encountering a thing they don't yet have the right frame for. Not gratitude. Not yet. Something more unsettled than gratitude. More searching. Then a uniformed officer said something to her, and she looked away. Mason finished his coffee, checked his watch. 11:22 a.m. He still had time to make the transfer before noon. He waited for the detective to formally release him, pulled his jacket tighter against the October cold, and thought about chicken nuggets and red dye. And a 7-year-old who was currently in school 3 miles away, absolutely unaware that her father had just spent 2 hours on the floor of a bank deciding which risks were worth taking and which rooms to walk into. She'd probably trade her lunch again on Thursday. He'd have to talk to the teacher. The transfer went through at 11:47 a.m. Mason sat in the Civic in the bank's parking lot. A different bank, a credit union 12 minutes east on Route 7 that he'd driven to on autopilot after the police released him, and watched the confirmation screen on his phone until the number stopped moving and the word completed appeared in green. $4,200. Gone. Exactly where it needed to go. He set the phone on the passenger seat and sat there for a minute, not moving, just breathing. The clicking sound happened when he turned left out of the parking lot, and he noticed it with the same detached awareness he'd been applying to everything since walking out of First Meridian. His hands were steady on the wheel. They'd been steady the whole time. That wasn't bravery. That was just the way his nervous system had been rewired over years of operating in conditions that didn't permit trembling, and sometimes he was grateful for it, and sometimes, mostly at night, mostly when Lily was asleep and the house was quiet, he thought about what it had cost to build that kind of steadiness, and whether the price had been fair. He picked Lily up from school at 3:15 like always. She came running out with her backpack swinging sideways and her left shoe half untied, which she'd clearly been walking on all day because the lace was gray with dirt. "Dad?" she announced, hitting him at mid-torso with the full momentum of a 7-year-old who understood neither her own velocity nor other people's rib cages. "Hey, Bug," he said, and picked her up, and she smelled like school, that specific combination of crayon and hand sanitizer and someone else's lunch, and he held on a few seconds longer than he normally did. She pulled back and looked at his face with the unsettling accuracy that small children have. "You look weird. I had a long morning. Did something happen?" "Nothing to worry about," he said. She studied him for another second with her mother's eyes. The same particular shade of brown, the same quality of attention that always made him feel slightly seen through. And then she dropped the subject with the merciful flexibility of a child who trusted that information would come when it was ready. "I didn't trade my lunch," she said. "Good. But Emma traded hers with me." "That's not better, Lily." "It was apple slices," she said, with the confident moral reasoning of someone who had already decided apple slices were ethically neutral. "Apple slices are healthy." He buckled her into the back seat and drove home with the window cracked, listening to her describe the elaborate social drama of 2nd grade while the October air came through the gap and the radio played something low that he wasn't hearing. He made dinner, pasta from a box because he was tired and he'd forgotten to thaw anything, and he helped her with 20 minutes of reading homework, and he supervised her bath without participating in the argument about whether 7-year-olds needed to wash behind their ears, and by 8:30 she was in bed with her library book open on her chest and her eyes already going soft. He sat on the edge of her bed for a moment after she fell asleep. He thought about the woman in the scrubs and the way her hands had shaken against the carpet. He thought about the elderly man who'd held his manila envelope through the whole thing. Mason had seen him still clutching it when the tactical team came through. This one small, portable proof that his life contained things worth keeping. He thought about Anvil sitting on the hallway floor, blood from his temple tracking down into the balaclava, breathing steadily while the alarm screamed around him. Mason had not wanted to hurt anyone. That was always true, and also always a complicated kind of true, because the alternative was not hurting anyone while other people got hurt instead, which was a trade he'd made the same way he always made it, and then carried home like he always carried it. He closed Lily's door halfway. She liked the hall light, a strip of yellow under the door, and he called his sister. Carla picked up on the second ring. "You're alive," she said. "I'm alive. I left you a voicemail 4 days ago." "I know. I'm sorry." I'm not yelling at you. I'm just noting it for the record. She paused. What happened? You sound strange. I was in that bank robbery, he said. First Meridian, downtown. This morning. Silence. Then, Mason. I'm fine. Everyone's fine. They arrested all three. Mason, that was all over the news. Were you there when it... Yeah. Are you... Okay. Are you okay? I'm fine, Carla. That's not an answer. He leaned against the kitchen counter, looking at the half-finished pot of pasta on the stove. I made the transfer for Lily's school. The money went through. Another silence, this one different. Carla had known him long enough to understand when he was redirecting, and she had the rare quality of knowing when to let him redirect. Good, she said. That's good. Then, do you need me to come over? No, I'm good. I just wanted to call you back. All right, she said, and then, quietly, I'm glad you called. He slept badly, which was nothing new, and was up by 5:30 with coffee and the particular quiet of a house before a child wakes up. He sat at the kitchen table with the laptop open to the local news, which had run footage of the scene outside First Meridian, the tactical vehicles, the ambulances, hostages being walked out under emergency blankets, the anchors with their grave professional expressions. One headline read, Hero Inside. Bank hostage disarms 2 armed robbers. He read it once, closed the tab, and looked at the wall for a while. His phone had 7 missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Reporters, he assumed, and a voicemail from Detective Reyes asking him to come into the precinct that afternoon for follow-up documentation. Not questioning, documentation. The distinction was important and also probably meaningful. What he didn't expect was the email. It came at 6:14 in the morning from an address at helixcapitalgroup.com with a subject line that read simply, Yesterday. He stared at it for a moment before opening it. Mr. Hale, I hope this finds you well. I recognize that after yesterday that's a strange thing to say, but I mean it plainly. I asked Detective Reyes for your contact information, and I appreciate him passing along your email. I'd like to speak with you, if you're willing, not for any official purpose. Personally, I owe you that much, at minimum. E. Carter. He read it twice. Set the coffee down. Read it once more. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he drove Lily to school, came back, sat down with the laptop again, and typed, Ms. Carter? I'm not sure you owe me anything, but I don't mind talking. When works for you. He sent it before he could rethink the wording, which probably could have used rethinking. She responded in 4 minutes, which told him something about the woman. They met 2 days later at a coffee shop she'd suggested in the Westfield district. A small, independent place, not the kind with a line out the door and a menu written on slate tiles. The kind with mismatched chairs and a real espresso machine and a woman behind the counter who knew her regulars. It was a Thursday. The fall potluck had been the previous day, and Mason had shown up with store-bought rolls and been right about nobody noticing, or at least nobody mentioning it. He arrived 4 minutes early. She was already there. Evelyn Carter in person, without the context of a bank floor and a hostage crisis, was a different visual. Not smaller. She still carried herself with the kind of precision that suggested a person who had learned early that the world would try to minimize her and had decided not to cooperate with that, but more human around the edges. She was dressed plainly, dark jeans, a charcoal sweater, and her hair was down, which changed the geometry of her face in a way that made her look somewhere between her actual age and slightly older, depending on the angle. She was reading something on her phone when he came in. She put it away immediately when she saw him, which he noted. Mr. Hale, she said. Mason, he said. Please. Evelyn, she said, and extended her hand. They shook. Her grip was firm in a way that wasn't performing firmness. He got a coffee, black, nothing added, and came back to the table and sat across from her. The coffee shop noise was low, comfortable, a murmur of other conversations, and an espresso machine and rain starting against the windows outside. She looked at him for a moment in a way that made him think she was trying to reconcile 2 different images, the one she'd seen on the floor of First Meridian, quiet and still while everyone else panicked, and whatever the news coverage had added to that in the 48 hours since. The resulting expression was something he recognized, the face of a person doing active, honest revision. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," she said. "I'm doing it anyway, so let me finish." She paused, organizing something. "I run a company. I make decisions under pressure as part of my professional life. I've been in rooms where things went wrong in significant ways, and I've had to manage that." She looked at her coffee cup, then back at him. "I have never been in a situation where I was genuinely afraid in the way I was afraid on Tuesday. And I watched you, from the moment they came through the door, and I couldn't figure out what I was looking at." "What do you mean?" "Most people in that situation go one of two ways. They freeze, or they make bad decisions because panic replaces thinking. You did neither. You were—" She paused again, reaching for the right word and clearly not satisfied with the ones available. "Methodical. In a way that shouldn't have been possible given what was happening in that room." Mason wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I was scared," he said. "I don't think you're lying," she said. "I just don't think scared is a complete description." "It's a complete description," he said. "Fear and function aren't mutually exclusive. I've just had more practice running them at the same time." She looked at him. "Military? Navy. How long?" 11 years. She absorbed that. "Why did you leave?" It wasn't an intrusive question, the way she asked it. It was direct, which was different. She seemed like a person who asked direct questions because she thought indirect ones wasted everyone's time. "My daughter needed a full-time parent," he said, "and I wanted to be that." "Her mother?" "Not in the picture. Has been for about 3 years." Evelyn nodded once. She didn't offer condolences or ask follow-up questions about it, which he appreciated. Filling in that space was something most people did reflexively, out of social anxiety more than genuine concern, and the gap she left instead was respectful. "I have to ask you something," she said. "And I want you to answer honestly, even if the honest answer sounds strange." "Okay." "When you stood up and told them about the secondary vault, that was a lie, wasn't it?" He looked at her across the table. "Yes." "You made it up on the spot to get them away from the lobby." "Partly," he said, "and partly to get myself into a position where I could access the emergency system in the corridor." "You planned all of that while you were lying on the floor." "I planned most of it in the first 5 minutes. The rest I adapted as I went." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain was picking up against the glass. The woman behind the counter was saying something to a regular, laughing at something, the easy back and forth of a place that has its rhythms. "Why me?" Evelyn said. "When they focused on me, when he started questioning me, you stepped in. You could have stayed on the floor." "Because the plan required buying time," he said, "and because he was starting to see you as an asset, a negotiating chip. Once that shift happens, the dynamic changes in ways that are harder to predict." "That's the tactical answer." He met her eyes. "That's the only answer I've got." She smiled at that. Small, a little dry. "You're not very good at accepting gratitude, are you?" "I'm not very good at a lot of social things," he said. "My sister tells me regularly." "What things is she referring to specifically?" "Returning calls, potluck sign-up sheets, general communication." She laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polished one. It broke through the precision she carried in her face and revealed something underneath it that was warmer and less composed. "I understand the call thing," she said. "I have 3 assistants whose full-time job is returning my calls because I can't make myself do it." 3 assistants for calls? 2 for calls. 1 is mostly scheduling and the occasional fire. That's a lot of people whose job it is to be you in small ways. "That's a very specific way to put it," she said. She turned her coffee cup a quarter turn. Helix Capital manages about $4 billion in assets across 9 countries. On Tuesday morning, I was walking into that bank to sign the final paperwork on a merger that's been in negotiation for 14 months. She said it matter-of-factly, not as a brag, more as context. 14 months of work? And then I ended up on a bank floor counting ceiling tiles and trying not to think about what happens if someone makes the wrong decision. "What were the tiles like?" She blinked. Sorry? The ceiling tiles. While you were counting them. A pause. Then the edge of another laugh. Water stained. One of them had a brown ring in the corner. I remember being annoyed by it. I don't know why. It's grounding, he said. The brain looks for specific details when it's overwhelmed, gives it something manageable to hold on to. Is that a Navy SEAL thing? It's a human thing, he said. SEALs just have more opportunities to discover it. She looked at him for a moment, a different kind of looking than before, more considered, less cataloging. Can I ask what you do now? Work-wise. Security. Overnight shifts, mostly. Warehouse complex out on Route 9. Overnight. Lily's at school during the day. I sleep when she does, more or less. More or less, she repeated with a tone that suggested she understood what more or less meant in that context. It works, he said. For now. She picked up her coffee. I want to propose something, and I want you to not answer right away. I want you to hear the whole thing before you respond, because the instinct is going to be to say no. You don't know my instincts. I watched you for 2 hours in a bank robbery, she said. I have some idea. He leaned back in his chair and gestured with one hand. Go ahead. She set the coffee down. After the merger closes, which is happening regardless, the Tuesday delay was a setback, but not a critical one. I'm going to be in a position to redirect a portion of Helix's philanthropic allocation. I've been thinking for some time about crisis preparedness, not the corporate version, the policy version. The actual version, training programs, response frameworks, civilian preparedness at the organizational level. The kind of thing that doesn't exist in any systematic way right now because nobody builds it until after something goes wrong. He was listening without his face moving much, which she seemed to clock and continue through anyway. What I saw you do on Tuesday, she said, wasn't just skill. It was a specific kind of thinking, situational, adaptive, calm under extreme pressure, that I've spent years trying to find in people I hire for crisis management roles and almost never actually find. Because there's a significant difference between someone who can manage a crisis on paper and someone who's actually been in one and made decisions that mattered. I'm not a consultant, Mason said. I'm not asking you to consult, she said. I don't know exactly what I'm asking yet. That's why I said hear the whole thing, because the whole thing is still being developed. She looked at him steadily. I'm asking if you'd be willing to have more conversations about it. That's all, more conversations. He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Route 9, the overnight shifts, the hum of the fluorescent lights in the warehouse, the security rounds he did at 2 and 4 and 6 in the morning through rows of stacked pallets, his footsteps the loudest thing in the building. He thought about the confirmation screen on his phone. Completed. $4,200, and the knowledge that he'd be doing it again in 90 days, scraping the same edges of the same margins, and the warehouse contract wasn't guaranteed past March. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking. He nodded once. They finished their coffee. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady rhythm against the glass, and the woman behind the counter had started a new conversation with a different regular, the espresso machine punctuating the spaces between sentences. When they stood to leave, he held the door. She paused in the doorway, pulling on her coat, and looked at him with that same direct revising quality he'd noticed at the table. You said you wanted to go home, she said. That's what you told him. The reason you gave. Yeah. Was that the real reason? He thought about the woman in the scrubs whose hands had shaken, the elderly man with his envelope, the college kids, Patricia the branch manager with her name tag and her terror, 27 people he'd never met before Tuesday morning and would likely never see again. It was part of it, he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then she nodded, a small, precise acknowledgement, like she'd confirmed something she'd already suspected, and walked out into the rain. He stood in the doorway for a moment watching her go, her coat dark against the gray of the wet street, before he turned up his collar and followed her out. In the 2 weeks that followed, Mason did what he always did, worked his shifts, picked up Lily, made the rounds of her homework and her school events, and her small, specific dramas about which friend had said what to whom on which day and whether it was fair. He fixed the clicking sound in the Civic, a loose heat shield, $40 job, and called Carla back twice and even returned one of the reporter calls, which lasted 90 seconds before he said he wasn't interested in interviews and hung up politely. The story faded from the local news in the way that stories do when nobody prominent was hurt and the perpetrators were cleanly arrested. 3 men, 2 with prior records, 1 first offense, were in county lockup pending arraignment. Detective Reyes sent him a follow-up email confirming that his account matched the physical evidence and thanking him for his cooperation. It was professional and brief, and he appreciated both qualities. He and Evelyn exchanged 3 emails in that period. Not arranged meetings, just messages that emerged from the shape of the first conversation. She sent him a link to a report on civilian emergency preparedness with a note that read, "This is what currently passes for the state of the art. You'll see why I'm not impressed." He read the report on his lunch break during a warehouse shift and wrote back, "The section on communication redundancy is about 10 years behind, and they've clearly never actually run a drill with untrained civilians in it." She wrote back within the hour, "Exactly. Would you be willing to look at a framework I've been sketching?" He said yes. She sent it. It was rough, the kind of first draft rough, where the instinct is clearly good and the structure hasn't caught up with the instinct yet. She'd identified the core problem correctly. Most crisis preparedness training was designed for responders, not for the ordinary population of people who are present when something happens and have no training at all. The framework she'd sketched tried to address that gap, but ran into the same problem every civilian program ran into, which was that it couldn't account for the variable of actual human behavior under extreme stress. Mason read it twice, sitting at the kitchen table after Lily was in bed, the house quiet around him. Then he opened a new document and started writing notes that turned into pages that turned into a substantial revision, and by midnight he'd sent back something that was 4 times the length of what she'd sent him, with a note that read, "I've probably overstepped. Tell me if I have." She wrote back the next morning, "You haven't. This is exactly what I was hoping for. Can we meet?" They met on a Saturday. Not the coffee shop. She suggested her office because she had materials she wanted to show him, and he showed up on the 7th floor of a downtown building that smelled like carpet cleaning solution and good ventilation, and was met in the lobby by one of the 3 assistants, a young man named Derek, who took his coat and offered him coffee with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it long enough to make it feel natural rather than servile. The office itself was sparse, in a way that felt deliberate rather than minimalist. A large desk, clear of everything except what was currently being worked on. One wall of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Bookshelves that had actual books on them, spines cracked, some flagged with torn paper, not decorative arrangements. A whiteboard with writing on it that she hadn't erased, which he liked. People who erase their whiteboards before visitors are performing a different self than the one that actually works. She was on a call when he arrived. She saw him through the glass wall, held up one finger, a minute, and wrapped up whatever she was saying in about 45 seconds, which was either impressive timing or the particular skill of someone who ends calls as a regular professional competency. "You marked it up significantly," she said, coming out of the glass office. "I warned you." "You did. I appreciated the warning, and then you did it anyway." She gestured him toward a long table with chairs along one side covered in printed documents. "Come look at this." What followed was 3 hours that Mason would later have difficulty summarizing concisely to anyone who asked, because the shape of it didn't fit the expected shape of a business meeting or a planning session. It was more like 2 people unpacking the same problem from opposite sides of a wall and finding that the holes they'd each made were almost aligned. She knew the organizational side, the infrastructure, the funding mechanisms, the institutional partnerships that could make something like this real instead of theoretical. He knew the operational side, the specific, granular ways that human beings behave when they're frightened, the things that training could and couldn't change. The difference between a protocol that looks good on paper and one that might actually work when everything goes sideways. They disagreed about 3 things substantially and didn't resolve 2 of them, which was fine. The third they worked through, and the working through of it produced something better than either of their original positions, which was the best possible outcome. At some point, Derek appeared with sandwiches without being asked, which suggested he'd been monitoring the room's energy and made a judgment call. Mason noticed and filed it as a data point about what it meant to work for Evelyn Carter. "Tell me about the SEAL teams," she said, somewhere around the second hour. Not out of nowhere. They'd been discussing high-pressure decision-making and the way it's taught versus the way it actually develops. What specifically? How much of it transfers to civilian contexts. He thought about it for a moment. Less than people think and more than they expect. The technical skills are specific. Most of them don't transfer directly. But the underlying structure of how you process a situation, how you hold information while you're moving, how you separate what's happening from what you're afraid is happening, that structure is teachable. It's not comfortable to learn, but it's teachable. You've thought about that. "I've thought about a lot of things on overnight shifts," he said. She looked at him across the table. "You're wasted on Route 9. "Route 9 pays on time," he said, "which is not nothing." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What would it take?" He looked back at her. "What would what take?" "To do this," she said, gesturing at the papers between them, "properly, with actual resources. What would it take for you to say yes?" "You haven't officially asked yet." "I'm asking now." He looked at the window. The city outside, gray and autumn lit. The traffic moving in the street below with the indifferent continuity of a world that doesn't pause for the people inside buildings making decisions. He thought about Lily, who had eaten her own lunch again yesterday and come home to tell him about it with the particular satisfaction of a child who knows they've done the right thing and wants credit for it. "I'd need to be able to work hours that let me be home for my daughter," he said. "Non-negotiable." "Understood. And I'm not a figurehead. If I'm involved in building something, I'm actually building it. I'm not a story you put on a brochure." "I don't need a story," she said. "I need someone who knows what they're doing." He looked at her. She looked back. In the flat gray light from the windows, with the remains of 2 sandwiches and a table full of papers between them, there was nothing cinematic about the moment. It was just 2 people, both of them tired and imperfect, and caring more than they always showed, recognizing something in each other that was difficult to name but unmistakable once seen. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" "I'll do it," he said. "Whatever this is." "Yeah." She nodded once, the same precise acknowledgement she'd given him in the coffee shop doorway. Then she picked up a pen and drew a circle around something on the paper in front of her, already moving. He looked at the circled section. Then he picked up his own pen. Outside, the city kept moving. The afternoon light dropped slowly through the floor-to-ceiling windows, shifting the color of everything in the room by degrees, the way the light does when nobody is paying attention to it. They worked until the building's cleaning staff arrived and started vacuuming the hallway, which was the kind of signal that couldn't be misread. The thing about building something from nothing is that it looks, from the outside, like it should be exciting. And sometimes it is. But mostly it's spreadsheets and phone calls that don't get returned, and rooms full of people who are interested in principle but cautious in practice, and the particular exhaustion of trying to explain a vision that doesn't have a physical form yet to people who need to touch things before they believe in them. Mason learned this in the first month. His official title on the consulting agreement Derek had emailed him was Senior Crisis Response Advisor, which sounded more significant than the reality of it, which was that he spent 3 mornings a week in Evelyn's conference room working through frameworks with her and a rotating cast of people she brought in. An emergency management specialist named Gross, who had 20 years with FEMA and a deeply skeptical expression that never fully relaxed. A former ER trauma coordinator named Baines, who talked fast and asked good questions. A policy researcher from a university whose name Mason kept forgetting and had to check on the lanyard every time. The hours worked, mostly. He was home by 2 most days, which gave him time before the school pickup at 3:15. The nights on Route 9 were over. He'd given 2 weeks' notice the day after the Saturday meeting, and his supervisor, a quiet man named Tolliver, who'd always treated him fairly, had shaken his hand and said he hoped it worked out. "Better hours?" Tolliver had asked. "Different hours," Mason said. "Better for my kid." Tolliver had nodded like that was the only answer that mattered. The work itself, the actual substance of what they were building, was harder to define than Mason had expected, and he'd expected it to be hard to define. The core idea was sound. Create a training architecture that prepared ordinary people for crisis situations, not by turning them into first responders, but by giving them a functional framework for their own behavior when things went wrong. How to assess a situation without panicking. How to make a decision when information was incomplete. How to be useful instead of becoming part of the problem. Simple idea, complicated execution. Gross was the biggest obstacle, not because he was obstructionist, but because he was experienced enough to know where every good intention went to die. In their third meeting, he'd leaned back in his chair with his coffee and said flatly, "I've watched 6 organizations try to build exactly this. 4 of them spent 2 years and significant money and produced a training manual nobody read. 1 produced a program that worked beautifully in controlled environments and completely fell apart the first time they ran it with actual untrained participants. The 6th one, I'm still not sure what happened to them." "What was different about the 5th one?" Mason asked. Gross looked at him. They had people who'd actually been in the situations they were training for, not studying them, not analyzing them, in them. "Then we have an advantage," Evelyn said. Gross looked at Mason. "How many active crisis situations have you been in, specifically situations involving civilian populations?" "Operationally, dozens. Directly involving civilians in acute danger?" Mason thought about it. "Fewer, maybe 8 or 9 where the civilian component was the central variable." "And the bank?" "And the bank?" Gross nodded slowly, in the way of a man who is revising his skepticism without fully abandoning it. "The problem," he said, "isn't designing the training. It's the delivery mechanism. You can build the best framework in the history of emergency preparedness, and if you can't get it in front of the populations that need it in a form they'll actually engage with, you've built nothing." "Schools," Baines said. She'd been quiet for most of the meeting, making notes on a yellow legal pad. "Corporate environments, community organizations, the delivery mechanism is the existing institutional infrastructure. You don't build a new vessel, you pour into the ones that already exist." "That requires institutional buy-in," Gross said, which requires exactly the kind of relationships Helix has spent 15 years building, Evelyn said. She said it without sharpness, just matter-of-factly, the way she stated most things. "That's not an obstacle. That's our access point." Gross considered this, turned his coffee cup in a small circle on the table. "All right," he said finally. "Show me the revised framework." Mason pushed the document across the table. Those early weeks had a quality of momentum that was also underneath a quality of constant friction, the kind that happens when multiple intelligent people who disagree on specifics are all genuinely trying to build the same thing. There were arguments. A real one, between Mason and Baines, about whether the training should include physical components or remain entirely cognitive and behavioral. Baines's position was that physical training created liability exposure and self-selected for participants who were already capable, leaving out the majority. Mason's position was that cognitive frameworks without any physical grounding were abstract in a way that failed under real stress, because stress is a physical experience, and the brain needs a physical anchor. They went back and forth across a conference table for 20 minutes, neither of them moving. Evelyn watched without intervening, which Mason noted and appreciated. She had the quality of a person who understood that some disagreements needed to be fully inhabited before they could be resolved. It was Gross who eventually said quietly, "You're both right and both describing different phases of the same program. The cognitive framework is the foundation. The physical grounding is the reinforcement layer. You don't run them simultaneously for the same population." Baines and Mason looked at each other. "Fine," Baines said. "Fine," Mason agreed. It wasn't elegant, but it moved them forward. Outside the conference room, things were less defined. Mason drove the Civic with its repaired heat shield to and from meetings, picked Lily up from school, made dinners that ranged from adequate to actively bad depending on how the day had gone. He was tired in a different way than the warehouse shifts had made him tired. Less physically ground down, more mentally occupied, the kind of tiredness that follows you to bed and has opinions about whether you sleep. Lily, who had the social intelligence of a child raised by a parent who didn't perform emotions well, had started watching him the way she sometimes did, with the patient, sideways attention of someone who has noticed a change and is waiting to understand it. "You're on your laptop at the kitchen table now," she said one evening, with the tone of a scientist noting a new data point. "I am," Mason said. "You used to just sit there." "I know." "Do you like it better, the laptop thing?" He looked at her across the table. She had a drawing in front of her. Horses, she was going through a horse phase. Every surface in the house was covered in horse drawings of varying quality. "I think so," he said. "Yeah." She seemed to accept this. She went back to her drawing. Then, without looking up, "Is it because of the lady from the bank?" He paused. "What?" "I heard you tell Aunt Carla," she said, still drawing, "that you were working with someone from the bank where the bad guys were." He'd had that conversation with Carla in the kitchen while Lily was supposedly watching television in the other room. He'd thought she was watching television. "That was a private conversation," he said. "The TV was boring," she said, with complete equanimity. He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It's work I'm doing with someone I met at the bank." "Is she nice?" "She's professional," he said. Lily looked up. "That's not the same thing." "No," he said. "It's not." She went back to her horse. "Okay," she said. Evelyn, in the context of the work, was professional, was accurate, but Lily was right that it wasn't complete. She was direct in a way that occasionally startled him because he wasn't used to it outside of operational contexts, where directness was the baseline. She asked specific questions and expected specific answers. She didn't hedge her own opinions. She also, Mason was learning, had a register that she operated in with people she trusted that was warmer and less architectural than her professional mode. Moments where the precision dropped slightly and something more conversational came through, usually when they'd been working for several hours and the formal structure of the meeting had worn thin. One late afternoon in December, when Gross and Baines had both left, and it was just the two of them in the conference room with the remnants of a working lunch and a whiteboard that had been written on and partially erased and written on again, she looked at the whiteboard and said, "Do you ever think it's not going to work?" He looked at her. "Specifically, what part?" "Any of it," she said. "The whole structure. The training program, the delivery framework, the partnerships. Sometimes I look at all of it and I think, we're two people who met under genuinely terrible circumstances and decided, for reasons that seemed to make sense at the time, to try to build something significant together." She paused. "Which sounds, when I say it out loud, somewhat improbable." "Most things that work sound improbable before they work," he said. "That's either wisdom or motivated reasoning." "Probably both," he said. She smiled at that. Not the small, dry, edge-of-the-mouth version, a fuller one, the kind that reached the rest of her face. It happened occasionally, and it was always slightly disarming, the way it changed the geometry of how she looked. "My board is asking questions," she said. "The philanthropic allocation has been approved, but there are people on the board who are skeptical of the scope. They want to see a pilot." "When?" "Spring," she said. "March or April. We run a controlled pilot with two organizations, one corporate, one community-based, and we measure outcomes and report back." "That's 4 months. It's 4 months," she said. "Is that enough time?" He thought about it. "It's enough time if Gross stops revising the cognitive framework every time we get close to finalizing it. I'll talk to Gross. Don't threaten him. He responds better to—" "I know how Gross responds," she said. "I've worked with him before." He looked at her. "You already knew him before this." "I called him when we were putting the team together. We'd crossed paths on a FEMA consultation 2 years ago." "You didn't mention that." "I didn't think it was relevant." "It's relevant context for understanding his skepticism," Mason said. "He's skeptical of the project, or he's skeptical of you specifically?" She met his gaze. "Probably some of both," she said. "Gross is skeptical of people with money who want to solve problems with money. He's had bad experiences with well-funded projects that were really just image rehabilitation for their funders." "Is this image rehabilitation?" "No," she said, flatly, without defensiveness. "It's not, but I understand why someone would need evidence of that." "Then show him the evidence," Mason said. "Run the pilot well. That's the evidence." She looked at him for a moment. "You're very practical. You say that like it's surprising." "I say it because it's useful," she said. I have a lot of people around me who are good at vision and not as good at the specific steps between vision and outcome. You go directly to the steps. Steps are what actually happen, he said. Vision is what you tell people so they understand why the steps matter. She held his gaze for a second longer than the conversation required. Then she looked back at the whiteboard. The pilot organizations, she said. I have candidates. I want your input on selection. Send me the list. I'll send it tonight. He nodded, started gathering the papers from his side of the table. Outside the conference room windows, the December afternoon had gone dark early the way December afternoons do. The city lights coming on in the glass towers across the street, the sky above them the particular dense gray of a winter evening in a northern city. Mason, she said. He looked up. Thank you, she said, for the work, for taking it seriously. You don't have to. Shh. I know, she said. I'm doing it anyway. He recognized the echo of the coffee shop conversation. From the way the corner of her mouth moved, she recognized it too. The pilot organizations were selected in January, a mid-sized insurance company with 1,100 employees at their regional headquarters, and a community center on the east side that ran programs for 4 distinct neighborhood populations, including a significant elderly demographic and a youth program. The contrast was deliberate and Gross's idea, which Mason had immediately agreed with. If the framework could work for both, it had a genuine argument for scalability. If it only worked for one, they'd know exactly which design assumptions needed revision. The preparation work was significant. Mason spent February going back and forth between both organizations, doing assessment visits that he'd insisted on himself. Not to evaluate the physical spaces, Baines handled that, but to understand the populations. Who was in the room? What they knew and didn't know. What they were afraid of in ways they might not articulate directly. The insurance company had the particular culture of a large organization that believed it was already prepared for everything because it had binders that said so. Mason sat in 3 of their existing safety briefings and watched employees look at their phones while a safety officer narrated a PowerPoint that had last been updated during a different administration. The questions people asked at the end were all procedural. Where are the exits? What's the meeting point? And none of them touched on the harder, more honest questions, which were, what do I actually do when I'm afraid, and how do I stay useful when everything around me is going wrong? The community center was different. The populations there had often encountered situations they hadn't prepared for. Economic disruption, medical emergencies, the specific kind of crisis that doesn't look like the movies because it's slower and quieter and doesn't resolve in 90 minutes. The youth programs had kids who were matter-of-fact about danger in a way that the insurance employees weren't, and the elderly demographic had a practicality born of long experience with things going unexpectedly wrong. Mason sat in on a Thursday afternoon session and ended up staying 2 hours past his planned visit because the conversation that developed was more substantive than anything he'd heard in the conference room. He told Evelyn about it the next morning. She'd already spoken to Baines, who'd made similar observations. The community center is the harder design problem, Evelyn said, but it's the more important one. The insurance company is where the money is, Mason said. The insurance company is where the board sees the scalability story, she said. The community center is where the program actually has to prove what it is. She paused. I'm not conflating the two. I didn't think you were, he said, and he meant it. March arrived with the particular stubbornness of early spring in a northern city. Cold still, the light shifting but not yet warm, muddy edges to everything. The pilot launch date was set for the 3rd week of the month. Mason ran the final run-throughs with both teams in the 2 weeks before, the kind of preparation that is partly logistical and partly the act of making everyone calm enough to function. The night before the first session, the insurance company, morning cohort, 42 participants, he was at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock, going through his notes for the 3rd time, when Lily appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, squinting against the kitchen light. You're up late, she said. So are you. I woke up. She came and climbed into the chair beside him, pulling her knees to her chest, looking at the papers on the table. Is it tomorrow? First session is tomorrow. Yeah. Are you nervous? He thought about it. Some. She leaned against his arm slightly. You're good at being calm, she said, even when you're scared. Where did you hear that? Aunt Carla, she said. She told me you were always like that, even when you were little. Carla is making things up. I was not calm as a child. She said you were calm on the outside, Lily said, and that it made it hard to know how you were doing. He looked at her. Did she say that as a warning or as a compliment? I think she wasn't sure, Lily said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, warm and small and smelling like whatever shampoo they were currently using. He looked at his notes. They were good notes. The program was good. In 4 months, they had built something that Gross, who did not give approval easily, had described as the most coherent civilian preparedness framework he'd encountered in 20 years of the field. That wasn't nothing. You should go back to bed, he said. I know, she said, without moving. He let her stay another few minutes. Then he walked her back to her room, closed the door to the right width, and went back to the kitchen and looked at his notes one more time. They were the same notes they'd been 10 minutes ago. He closed the folder. The insurance company session ran for 6 hours across a morning and afternoon, with a break for lunch. 42 participants in a large conference room, projected materials, facilitated exercises, and 3 hours of scenario-based discussion guided by Mason and Baines together, with Gross observing from a chair against the back wall, with his arms folded and his expression carefully neutral. It didn't go perfectly. The first exercise, a structured decision-making scenario presented through a narrative format, fell apart in the middle when 2 of the participants got into a debate about a tangential detail of the scenario, and the rest of the group got pulled into it. Mason had to redirect, firmly, but without making anyone feel corrected, which was the kind of facilitation that looked easy and wasn't. After the session, Gross found him in the hallway. The redirection on the first exercise, he said. How did you read the room? The 2 people arguing were both trying to be right in front of their colleagues, Mason said, not actually disagreeing about the content. I gave them both a partial validation and moved the scenario forward to a point where their disagreement became irrelevant. Gross looked at him for a moment. You've run groups before. Not formally, Mason said, but I've managed people in situations where getting them to function together was the difference between a good outcome and a bad one. Gross nodded slowly. The afternoon session was better, he said. Significantly better. The group had recalibrated. That was the design, Mason said. The morning session is supposed to be uncomfortable. Gross looked at him, then something shifted slightly in his expression. Not a smile. Gross wasn't really a smiler, but an adjustment that conveyed something in the neighborhood of respect. All right, he said. Let's see how the community center goes. The community center session was 3 days later, and it was different in every way that mattered. The space was smaller, the group was more varied. A Thursday evening slot with 31 participants ranging from a 16-year-old who came with his grandmother to a retired school teacher who had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. The dynamic was louder, more personal, and about 40% less deferential to the structure Mason was trying to maintain. It was also, by the end, the better session. The moment he recognized this was during the third scenario exercise, when the retired school teacher, whose name was Dottie, who had been pushing back on every prompt since the opening, stopped mid-comment, looked at the scenario on the projected screen and said, "That's exactly what happened when the power went out in the Millbrook Senior Center 3 winters ago. The reason people panicked is because they didn't have any framework for deciding what was their problem to solve versus what they had to wait for." The room went quiet in a listening way. "What did you do?" Mason asked. "I told everyone to find one other person," Dottie said. "Just one. And make sure that person was okay. Don't worry about the whole room, just one person, and then that person does the same thing." She paused. 32 people in a dark room, and inside of 10 minutes, we'd accounted for everyone and found the 2 people who needed medical attention. Mason looked at her. "That's a real protocol," he said. "You invented a real protocol under pressure." Dottie looked mildly unsettled by the validation. "I was just trying to stop the screaming." "That's what protocols are," Mason said. "Ways to stop the screaming." He looked at the rest of the room. What she did? That instinct to break an overwhelming problem into a single manageable action. That's the foundation of everything we're talking about tonight. And she didn't learn it from a manual. She learned it from being in the room. He saw Evelyn, sitting in the back row as an observer, write something in her notebook. He didn't know exactly what she wrote, but she underlined it. In the debrief the following week, the four of them, Mason, Evelyn, Gross, and Baines, went through the data from both sessions, pre- and post-assessments, participant feedback, facilitator observations. The numbers were early and limited by sample size, and Gross was the first to say so, but what they showed was consistent with what all of them had observed in the room: measurable shift in self-assessed confidence around crisis decision-making, particularly in the identification of a single actionable response under stress. The community center data is stronger, Baines said. The design fit the population better, Gross said. The corporate version needs refinement. I agree, Mason said. The morning exercise needs a different entry point for groups with high social accountability between participants. They're too worried about looking capable to admit they don't know what to do. So you design around the ego problem, Evelyn said. You design around the fact that social context affects decision-making under stress, Mason said. The ego isn't the problem. It's a variable you account for. Evelyn looked at him. That's a useful reframe. It changes what the exercise looks like at the front end, he said, which changes how the group enters the harder material in the afternoon. They kept going. The meeting ran 2.5 hours and ended with a document that was substantially revised from what they'd brought into the room, and better for it. Gross stayed until the end, which he hadn't always done in earlier meetings. Walking out to the parking lot afterward, Gross and Baines had left. It was just Mason and Evelyn under the building's exterior lights in the cold March evening. She said, "The board presentation is in 6 weeks." "I know." "We'll have the full pilot data by then." "We will." She was quiet for a moment, pulling her coat tighter. The parking lot was mostly empty at this hour, a few other cars from people still in the building, the city noise muffled by distance and cold air. "The community center session," she said, when Dottie spoke, "and you told her it was a real protocol." She paused. "That was the moment the room changed. I watched it happen." "She earned it," Mason said. "I just named it." "You gave her language for something she already knew," Evelyn said. "That's not nothing. That's actually most of what good teaching is." He looked at her. "I didn't know you'd thought about teaching." "I've thought about most things," she said. "I just don't always say them out loud." She found her car keys in her bag. 6 weeks, she said, the board presentation. "We'll be ready," he said. She looked at him across the short distance of the parking lot, the overhead light doing something plain and honest to both their faces. No architecture to either of them out here in the cold. "I know," she said, and got in her car. He stood in the parking lot for a moment after her taillights disappeared, his breath making small clouds in the March air, hands in his jacket pockets. He thought about Dottie saying, "I was just trying to stop the screaming." He thought about the way Evelyn had underlined something in her notebook. He drove home. The Civic's heater took 8 minutes to get warm, which he'd calculated precisely by now. He drove through the quiet residential streets, through the soft pattern of streetlights and dark windows, and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once, the way you do on a night when something that seemed possible is beginning, for the first time, to feel real. Lily was asleep. The house was quiet. He checked on her, the door slightly open, the hall light making its stripe across the floor, her library book open on the nightstand. And then he sat down at the kitchen table without turning on the laptop and just sat for a while in the stillness. Tomorrow he'd send Evelyn his notes on the board presentation structure. He already knew what he wanted to say. He just needed to find the right order for it. Outside, the March wind moved through the trees on the street, the last of winter making itself known before it let go. The board presentation was on a Thursday in late April, which meant Mason spent the Wednesday night before it sitting at the kitchen table going through the slide deck for the 4th time, while Lily ate cereal for dinner because he'd forgotten to defrost anything, and she'd accepted this with the philosophical flexibility of a child who understood that some nights were cereal nights. "You're doing the thing," she said. "What thing?" "The thing where you look at the same page over and over." "I'm reviewing." "You've been reviewing since I got home from school." She tipped the bowl to get the last of the milk. "Is it important tomorrow?" "Yeah, pretty important." "More important than the bank thing?" He looked up. She was watching him with the patient, unblinking attention she'd inherited from nobody he could identify, because he didn't look at people that way, and her mother hadn't either. It was just Lily's own quality, fully formed and entirely hers. "Different kind of important," he said. "Okay," she said. She took her bowl to the sink, rinsed it the way he'd taught her, cold water first, then warm, and came back and stood beside his chair, looking at the laptop screen. The slide on the screen was a data summary from the 2 pilot sessions, numbers in clean columns, the pre- and post-assessment results laid out in a format that Evelyn's design team had made considerably more presentable than Mason's original spreadsheet. "What does that mean?" Lily asked, pointing at a percentage. "It means that most of the people who went through the training felt more prepared for an emergency afterward than they did before." "Did they actually get better?" "That's a harder question," he said. We think so. We don't know for certain yet." She considered this. "That's honest," she said. "I try to be." "I know," she said. "Good luck tomorrow." She kissed him on the side of the head, a gesture she'd started doing recently, a reversal of direction that he found quietly startling every time, and went to get ready for bed. He sat with the laptop for another hour. Then he closed it and went to sleep at a reasonable time, which was harder than it sounded and which he managed by the same mechanism he'd used before operations, deliberately refusing to rehearse things he'd already prepared for. The Helix Capital boardroom was on the 14th floor with a long table that seated 16 and windows on 2 sides, and the particular atmosphere of a room in which significant decisions had been made regularly enough that the air itself felt slightly pressurized. 8 board members, 3 Helix executives, Gross and Baines present as technical advisors, Mason at one end of the table with the clicker for the slides, Evelyn at the other end, which was not an accident. They'd talked about the geometry of the presentation, the way the board would read the relationship between the two of them, and had agreed that physical distance across the table conveyed a professionalism that closeness wouldn't. Evelyn opened. She was good at this, not in a performed way, but in the way of someone who had stood in enough rooms like this that the room itself no longer intimidated her, and what remained was just the substance of what she was saying. She laid out the initiative's scope, the rationale, the gap in the existing landscape that they were addressing. Clear, specific, no flourishes. 7 minutes. Then she handed it to Mason. He'd been in briefings with generals. He'd presented operational plans in conditions where the stakes of a mistake were measured in lives, rather than quarterly returns. A boardroom should have been manageable by comparison, and mostly it was, except that the particular flavor of scrutiny in a boardroom, the financial kind, the ROI and liability kind, was different enough from the military kind that it required a different register. He'd thought about this. He'd adjusted accordingly. He went through the pilot data plainly, without overselling it. He showed what the numbers said, and also what they didn't say, because several people around this table would know the difference between a rigorous data presentation and a sales pitch disguised as one, and he wasn't here to sell anything. He described what he'd seen in both session rooms, not as anecdote, but as observational data, the kind that quantitative measures can't fully capture. He talked about Dottie. Not by name, he'd asked permission, and she'd said yes, but he'd decided against it anyway, because the point wasn't her specifically. The point was the pattern she represented. One participant, he said, described an improvised response she'd developed during an actual power outage at a senior center 3 years earlier. What she'd done, spontaneously, under pressure, was structurally identical to one of the core protocols in our framework. She'd arrived at it through necessity, without training. What our program does is give people access to that kind of thinking before the necessity arrives. The room was quiet in a listening way. He recognized the quality of it. A board member named Hargrove, 60s, silver-haired, the specific bearing of someone who had been skeptical of ideas for so long that it had become his default resting expression, leaned forward slightly. "The community center population," he said, "what's the argument for including it in the scalability model? The corporate sector is where the institutional infrastructure is." "The community center population is where the gap is largest," Mason said. "Corporate environments have existing safety infrastructure. Imperfect, as we've demonstrated, but present. Community organizations, particularly those serving elderly and economically stressed populations, have almost nothing. And statistically, those are the populations most likely to experience crisis situations and least likely to have access to any formal preparedness training. That's a social equity argument, Hargrove said, not a business case. It's both, Evelyn said, from the other end of the table. The community-based delivery creates the proof of concept for the most demanding design conditions. If the framework functions for a 31-person group spanning 60 years of age range and 4 distinct cultural backgrounds, the corporate application is the easier problem, not the harder one. Hargrove looked at her, then at Mason. Who runs this? Operationally, long-term. You're describing something that needs permanent infrastructure. We're describing the design phase of permanent infrastructure, Mason said, which is what this funding would support. The long-term operational model is built into the framework. Train-the-trainer components, institutional licensing, a certification structure that allows organizations to deploy the program independently once they've been properly credentialed. Timeline to self-sufficiency? 3 years to operational independence for the first cohort of certified organizations, Baines said, from her seat along the wall. Conservative estimate. Hargrove wrote something. Other board members were writing. Mason read the room the way he read rooms, not looking for approval, which you could confuse yourself chasing, but looking for the quality of engagement, people leaning slightly forward, pens moving, the absence of phone checking. It was going well. He didn't let that change how he was presenting. The questions ran for 40 minutes. Some of them were sharp. A board member named Tsui pushed hard on the assessment methodology and whether the pre-post survey design could actually measure behavioral change versus self-reported confidence, which was a genuinely good question that Mason answered honestly. It measured self-reported confidence, which was the appropriate first-stage measure, and behavioral validation would require longitudinal follow-up study, which was part of the Year 2 design. Tsui nodded, wrote something. When the questions finished, Evelyn thanked the board and the two of them left the room with Gross and Baines while the board deliberated. They waited in a smaller room down the hall, a sitting area with a couch and 2 chairs and a coffee setup that Mason went directly to because he needed something to do with his hands. Gross poured his own coffee and sat in one of the chairs. Baines checked her phone. Evelyn stood at the window, not looking at anything in particular. The city below, the afternoon light hitting the glass towers across the street. The usual indifferent business of the world continuing at street level. Tsui's question was fair, Mason said. Tsui's always fair, Evelyn said, without turning from the window. He's the one I was most prepared for. Hargrove. Hargrove will vote yes if Tsui does, she said. He respects Tsui's judgment on data questions, and Tsui seemed satisfied. You've read them all. I've worked with them for 6 years, she said. I know how they think. He drank his coffee. Gross made a remark about the assessment methodology question being predictable, and he and Baines had a brief technical exchange about it. The room had the particular suspended quality of a waiting period when everyone knows the outcome is out of their hands and is managing that in their own way. Evelyn turned from the window. She looked at Mason. You were good in there, she said. The material was good, he said. The material was good, and you were good, she said. They're not mutually exclusive. He looked at her. She looked back. Gross appeared to find something interesting in his coffee. Derek appeared in the doorway 22 minutes after they'd left the boardroom. They're ready, he said. The vote was 6-2 in favor of full funding. The 2 opposed were a board member named Weston, whose objection was timeline-based rather than substantive, and a woman named Park who had raised concerns about liability exposure in the community-facing sessions that Baines had already answered, but which Park hadn't fully accepted. Hargrove voted yes. Tsui voted yes. The funding amount was slightly below what Evelyn had requested and slightly above what Mason had privately expected, which put it in a range that was workable. Evelyn accepted the board's decision with the same precision she accepted everything. A nod, a brief acknowledgement, the specific professionalism of someone who is genuinely pleased but understands that the room is not the place for that to fully show. She thanked the board. She outlined the next steps. She moved them efficiently toward adjournment. In the elevator going down, just the 2 of them, Gross and Baines, having stopped to talk to someone in the hallway, she exhaled. It was a small sound, barely audible, but it was real. The sound of someone who had been holding something together for several hours, letting a portion of it go. 6-2, Mason said. 6-2, she said. Park will come around, he said, once the liability framework is documented properly. I know. She looked at the elevator doors. Weston's timeline objection is actually about something else. He thinks I move too fast. Do you? She considered this with the seriousness she gave most questions. Sometimes, she said. Not on this. The elevator opened. They walked through the lobby and out onto the street into the late April afternoon, which had finally, after the long resistance of the season, begun to feel like spring. The air was warmer, and there were people on the sidewalk with their jackets open, and the trees along the street had a thin new green to them, the particular tentative green of early leaves that haven't committed yet. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Mason had to pick up Lily in an hour and a half. What happens now? He said. Now we build it, she said. For real. He nodded. She looked at him. Something in her expression had shifted, not dramatically, but in the way that a small adjustment in angle changes what you can see of a face. The boardroom version of her was gone, replaced by the version he'd come to recognize across conference tables, and in parking lots, and in a coffee shop on a rainy October morning. The version that was more honest about the weight of things. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want you to answer it the same way you answered the board, without managing the response. Okay? Are you all right? With all of this, the pace of it, the scope, the way it's changed your... She paused, choosing her words. Your day-to-day. He thought about it, which was itself an answer to her question, in a way. That he had to think about it rather than deflecting it immediately. I'm better than I was, he said. The warehouse shifts were... I don't regret them. They were what Lily needed at the time, but this is... He stopped, recalibrated. This is work I care about, which turns out to make a significant difference. Does Lily know that? Lily knows everything, he said. She's 7 going on 40. Evelyn smiled at that. I'd like to meet her sometime, she said. It came out plainly, without construction, the way statements do when they're true, and the person saying them hasn't prepared a version of it for public consumption. He looked at her. She'd have opinions about you. I imagine she has opinions about most things. She does, he said. She gets it from her father. Her father has opinions, Evelyn said. He just delivers them in a way that makes them sound like neutral observations. That's a diplomatic way to put it. I'm occasionally diplomatic, she said. They stood on the sidewalk for another moment, the city moving around them, taxis and pedestrians, and a bike messenger cutting through with practiced indifference. The April light was doing something warm to the buildings across the street, turning the windows amber. I have to get Lily, he said. I know, go. She looked down the street for a moment, then back at him. Mason, today mattered. What we built matters. I want you to know I understand that it wasn't just mine. He held her gaze for a second. I know you know that, he said. That's why I'm here. He walked to the parking garage. She turned in the other direction. Neither of them looked back, which was either restraint or habit, and possibly both. The weeks that followed the board approval had a different texture than everything before them. Less hypothetical, more load-bearing. Real money meant real decisions, and real decisions meant real disagreements. And there was a period in May where Mason and Evelyn had 3 consecutive meetings that each ended with at least one unresolved tension between them. The first was about hiring. Evelyn wanted to move quickly, bring on a full operations team within 60 days. Mason thought 60 days was too fast, not because the people didn't exist, but because hiring fast in a field where cultural fit was as important as technical skill was how you built a team that looked right on paper and didn't function in the room. They went back and forth about it twice and landed, unhappily, on 90 days, which satisfied neither of them fully and was probably correct. The second was about the physical space. The initiative needed a home, not just office space, but a facility that could house the training programs themselves, with the kind of design that supported the experiential components of the curriculum. Evelyn had identified a building in the Arts District that was available, recently vacated by a tech startup that had relocated. It was good space, well designed, good natural light. Mason's objection was geographic. The arts district was accessible to the corporate population they were targeting, but not as accessible to the community-based populations, which required either a transit commute of 45 minutes or a car. For the Eastside Community Center participants, neither was trivial. "We can run satellite sessions at the community organizations," Evelyn said. "The satellite model creates a two-tier program," Mason said. "One that feels like the real version and one that feels like the outreach version. That's the thing we've been trying to avoid since October." She was quiet for a moment. "You're right," she said. And then, after another pause, "I hate it when the right answer is more expensive." "The Arts District building isn't right for us," he said. "I know," she said. "I liked it. It's a good building for something else." "I know that too." She pulled up her laptop. "There's a property near the Alderton Transit Hub. Less character, better access." He looked at the listing. She turned toward him. It was, as described, less character. A converted warehouse space, utilitarian, the kind of building that would need significant interior work to become what they needed. But the transit access was excellent, and the square footage was right, and the price was lower than the Arts District building, by enough to matter. "This one," he said. "This one," she agreed. The third disagreement, and the hardest, was about Mason's role going forward. It happened on a Friday afternoon in late May, in Evelyn's office rather than the conference room, which was itself a shift. They'd been meeting in the conference room for months, the shared neutral space of the work. The office felt more personal, the books on the shelves and the partially erased whiteboard and the afternoon light coming through the tall windows. She'd brought it up carefully, which meant she'd been thinking about how to bring it up before she did. "The operations team is going to need a director," she said. "Someone who runs the day-to-day, manages the staff, owns the curriculum delivery." "Gross," Mason said immediately. "If he'll do it." "Gross won't do it," she said. "He's told me. He'll stay in an advisory capacity, but he doesn't want operational responsibility at this stage of his career." "Baines. Baines is excellent at what she does," Evelyn said, "which is the trauma-informed design component. She shouldn't be a director. It would take her away from the work she's actually best at." He knew where this was going. He'd known since she said operations team with that particular quality of preparation in her voice. "No," he said. "Hear me out. I've heard you out on 3 previous occasions when you've approached this from different angles," he said. "The answer is the same." "Why?" "Because a director is an administrator," he said. "It's budget management and HR decisions and stakeholder communications, and that's not what I do well." "You manage stakeholders constantly. You did it in that boardroom." "That was one presentation," he said. "That's not the same as being someone's supervisor and reviewing their performance and handling the day-to-day infrastructure of an organization." "You ran SEAL teams," she said. "That's different." "How is it different?" "Because in that context, everyone in the room had the same fundamental orientation. They understood the stakes in a specific way. They'd been trained in a specific way. Managing a team of curriculum designers and trauma specialists and administrative staff requires a completely different skill set that I don't have, and—" He stopped, looked at her. "And I'm not being falsely modest. I know what I'm good at. I know what I'm not." She looked at him steadily. "What are you good at?" "The room," he said. "Being in the room when the training is happening, the design work, the operational framework, the part that happens with actual people in actual situations. That's where I function." "Then do that," she said, "and let someone else be the director." He paused. "That's what you wanted to say from the beginning." "No," she said. "What I wanted from the beginning was the director conversation, because I genuinely believe you could do it if you chose to. But I've listened to you for 6 months, and I understand the distinction you're drawing, and I think you're right about where your value is." She paused. "I just needed you to say it clearly, so we both know we're building around it intentionally, rather than by default." He looked at her for a moment. "That's a strange way to have a conversation." "It's the way I have conversations when something matters, and I'm not sure what the right answer is," she said. "I let the other person find it. That's manipulative." "It's facilitative," she said. "There's a difference."
Small one.
Sometimes, she said. He sat back in his chair. Outside her window, the May afternoon was fully warm now, the city in the kind of light that makes everything look more deliberate than it is. A pigeon landed on the window ledge and immediately left, apparently dissatisfied. "Who's the director?" he said. "I'm looking," she said. "I have someone in mind. Former FEMA regional coordinator, moved into the private sector 3 years ago, understands both the institutional and community-based sides of the work. I want you to meet her before I make an offer." "Her name?" "Diane Okafor. You can look her up." He looked her up that evening at the kitchen table while Lily did homework beside him. The horse phase had given way to a marine biology phase, and the homework in question involved drawing and labeling the parts of a fish, which Lily was approaching with the focused intensity she brought to anything she'd recently decided mattered. Diane Okafor had an impressive record. 18 years in emergency management, a master's in organizational psychology, 3 years running crisis preparedness programs for a mid-sized insurance conglomerate. The insurance background gave him a moment's pause, but her published work suggested someone who'd been frustrated by exactly the gap they were trying to fill, which was a better indicator than credentials alone. He met Diane Okafor 2 weeks later in the conference room, just the three of them: Mason, Evelyn, Diane. She was 52, direct in a way that reminded him slightly of Gross, but warmer through it, and she spent the first 20 minutes asking questions rather than answering them, which was the right instinct. She wanted to understand what they'd actually built before she assessed whether she wanted to be part of running it. He respected that. Midway through the meeting, she turned to Mason and said, "What's the thing you've gotten most wrong so far?" He thought about it. The corporate pilot design assumed a higher baseline of psychological safety than actually existed in that environment, he said. "We designed the opening exercise for a group that was ready to admit uncertainty. That group doesn't exist in a corporate room until you've spent an hour building toward it. We had to correct in real time." "And the correction?" "Reordered the exercises on the fly, changed the framing of the first scenario from a decision-making problem to an observation problem. Remove the performance pressure from the opening." Diane nodded slowly. "That's good instinct," she said. "Did it work?" "Partially," he said. "We redesigned the full sequence afterward. The revised version is in the framework documentation." She looked at Evelyn. "The documentation is thorough?" "Mason wrote most of it," Evelyn said. Diane looked back at Mason. "You document your own work." "If I don't, I repeat mistakes," he said, "and I have a bad enough memory for the ones I've already made." Something shifted in Diane's expression. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "All right," she said. "Tell me about the Alderton building." They talked for another hour. When Diane left, Mason and Evelyn sat for a moment in the conference room in the specific quiet that follows a meeting that went well. "Well?" Evelyn said. "Offer her the job," he said. "You're sure?" "She asked the right questions and she wasn't performing the asking," he said. "That's the thing you can't teach." Evelyn nodded. "She'll want to know about you," she said. "Your role. How the two of you fit together operationally." "Tell her the truth," he said. "I'm in the room when it matters." "She runs the building." Evelyn made the call to Diane the next morning. Diane accepted the following week, contingent on a start date of August 1st, which gave them the summer to get the Alderton building into shape. The renovation work started in June, and Mason spent parts of 3 weeks at the site with the contractor they'd hired, a woman named Falk, who communicated primarily in precise, clipped sentences and had the refreshing quality of someone who did exactly what she said she would do on the timeline she said she'd do it. He walked the space with her in the early stages, talking through the specific requirements of the training rooms. Not classrooms, not boardrooms, something in between, with the flexibility to reconfigure quickly and the acoustic quality to allow for group work without conversations bleeding between spaces. Lily came with him twice. The second time, Falk was walking them through the main training hall, which was still framing an exposed ceiling at that point, and Lily stood in the middle of the concrete floor and looked up at the rafters and said, "It's going to be big. It's going to be the right size," Mason said. "That's not the same thing." Falk looked at Lily, then at Mason. "She's right," Falk said. "It's going to be big." Lily looked satisfied. On the drive home, she was quiet for a while, which was unusual. Then she said, "Are you happy, Dad?" He drove for a moment without answering. The summer light was long and warm through the windshield, the kind of afternoon that doesn't push for anything. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." "You think?" "It's a complicated feeling," he said. "It has a lot of parts." She considered this. "Okay," she said, and then, "Does the lady from the bank make it better?" The complicated feeling. He kept his eyes on the road. We work well together," he said. Lily made a sound that was not a word but communicated something quite specific nonetheless. We're colleagues, Lily." "Okay, Dad," she said, with the serenity of someone who has already decided what they think and doesn't need to argue about it. He drove the rest of the way home in the warm afternoon light, and he didn't correct her again, partly because she was 7 and he wasn't going to win, and partly because some accurate things resist the urge to be corrected. The building was on schedule. Diane's start date was 6 weeks away. The board had approved the next funding tranche. Gross had agreed to stay on as senior advisor, which was the best possible outcome they'd hoped for and hadn't fully expected. At night sometimes, Mason sat at the kitchen table after Lily was asleep and thought about a Tuesday in October, the carpet that smelled like cleaning solution, the weight of a hollow aluminum chair leg under his hand. He thought about what had been in his head in those 90-some minutes on the floor. The exits, the math, the routines of 3 men with weapons, and a plan that was his job to dismantle. He thought about walking into that corridor with 2 armed men, the alarm handle cold in his hand, the specific measurement of a half-second's hesitation. He didn't regret any of it. He also didn't think of it as heroism, which was a word that had appeared in several follow-up emails from reporters he'd never responded to. It was a situation that needed a response, and he'd been capable of providing one. The fact that he'd been capable was the result of years and choices and costs that he'd already paid, and what he did with the capability once he had it was the only part that was still in his control. He thought about Evelyn on the floor of the lobby, cross-legged, jaw set, reading the room with the same precision she brought to boardrooms and coffee shops and renovation site walkthroughs. She'd been afraid. She'd functioned anyway. He'd recognized it instantly because it was the same thing he did, just in different terrain. 2 people who functioned under pressure, building something designed to help other people do the same. He thought there were worse foundations for a thing. He closed the laptop and went to check on Lily. The door opened the right amount, the hall light making its stripe across the floor. Her library book had migrated from the nightstand to the bed, open face down across her elbow, which he carefully removed and set on the nightstand, and she didn't wake. He stood in the doorway for a moment the way he always did. Not long, just a breath or two. The particular specific weight of a moment that doesn't announce itself as significant but accumulates into what a life is made of. Then he went to bed. The morning would have its own requirements. Diane Okafor started on a Monday in August, and by Friday of the same week she had reorganized the shared filing system, identified 3 redundancies in the hiring pipeline, and scheduled one-on-ones with every person on the nascent staff, 6 people at that point, with 4 more offers pending, in a way that made the whole operation feel suddenly, structurally real, in a way that months of planning had not quite achieved. Mason watched this from a slight distance and found it almost entirely reassuring and only slightly humbling. "She's better at the operational piece than I would have been," he told Evelyn on a Wednesday afternoon when they were walking the Alderton building together, a habit they'd developed during the renovation, a standing weekly walkthrough to track progress and make decisions on the things that Falk flagged for them. "I know," Evelyn said. She was looking at the main training hall, which had come a long way from the exposed rafters and concrete floor that Lily had stood in the center of 2 months earlier. The walls were finished now, painted a warm, neutral tone that Evelyn had picked and Mason had initially questioned and come to think was right. The floors were a sealed wood composite, easier on people who'd be standing for hours. The acoustic panels were up. The reconfigurable partition system that allowed the space to shift between 1 large room and 3 medium ones was installed and functional. "That's why we hired her." I said it without any kind of... I just meant it as an observation. "I know what you meant," she said. "You're not someone who has difficulty giving other people credit." "You say that like it's rare." It's rarer than it should be, she said. Falk appeared from the back hallway, in her usual state of looking like she'd just finished solving a problem that didn't need to be a problem. The secondary lighting in room 3 is done, she said. Come look. They followed her back through the building, through the connecting corridor that Mason had specifically requested be wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. It was a small thing, but the architecture of a space communicated something about the values of the people who built it, and narrow corridors communicated something that didn't match what they were trying to do here. Falk had charged them 4% more for the width. Mason had approved it without consulting Evelyn, which he'd mentioned afterward. You approved it without asking me, she'd said. It was my call to make. It was a budget decision above your authorization threshold. I know, he said. It was still the right call. She'd looked at him for a moment. Then she'd said, don't do that again, and moved on, which was exactly the right response, and which he respected for its precision. Not a confrontation, not a capitulation, just a clear line reinstated. He hadn't done it again. Room 3 had windows on the east side that the other training rooms didn't, and the secondary lighting Falk had installed complemented the natural light in a way that made the space feel open without being stark. Mason stood in it and thought about the kinds of sessions that would happen here. He thought about the insurance company conference room where the first pilot had been difficult in the opening hour, and Dottie's living room, metaphorically speaking, at the community center. He thought about what it meant to build a space that was genuinely neutral, that didn't belong to anyone's existing hierarchy, where a 65-year-old retired school teacher and a 40-year-old corporate middle manager were equally unfamiliar with their surroundings and therefore equally willing to be uncertain. That was the thing he kept coming back to. Uncertainty was the prerequisite. You couldn't teach people to function under extreme stress if they weren't willing to first admit they didn't know how. And most people, in most professional contexts, had spent years learning to perform competence so consistently that the performance had replaced the actual assessment. They didn't know what they knew. They didn't know what they didn't know, and nobody had ever given them a structured, safe context to find out. That was what this building was for. Good, he said to Falk. Falk took this with the measured satisfaction of someone who'd known the work was good and wanted the acknowledgement anyway. Punch list by end of week, she said. Full completion by the 22nd. The opening was scheduled for the first Saturday in October, a year, almost to the day, from the morning at First Meridian. Mason had noticed this when Evelyn first proposed the date, 3 months earlier, and had said nothing about it, because saying something about it would have made it into something it didn't need to be. But he'd noticed. The weeks between August and October had the quality of a controlled acceleration, everything moving faster as the opening approached, the staff growing from 6 to 11 to 14, Diane running the operational engine with a kind of steady, unglamorous competence that kept things from falling apart at the seams. Curriculum finalized. The certification program for organizational trainers built out and piloted with a test cohort of 12 people from 3 different sectors. Partnerships confirmed with 7 organizations for the inaugural program cycle, including the Eastside Community Center and, after an additional round of design revision, the insurance company from the original pilot, whose HR director had called Evelyn personally to say the first session had changed how his team thought about preparedness. Gross reviewed the certification framework in September and said it was the most rigorous civilian preparedness curriculum he'd encountered. He said it the way Gross said most things, without preamble, without embellishment, in a meeting where they were discussing something else entirely. Mason wrote it down afterward, not because he needed validation, but because he wanted a record of the specific moment. Bain sent him a long email in late September about the trauma-informed components of the curriculum with 14 suggested refinements, 11 of which he incorporated immediately, and 3 of which he brought to a joint session with her and Diane that resulted in a revised version better than any of the individual positions. He'd come to understand that this, the triangulated revision, the uncomfortable process of being wrong in front of people you respected and then arriving at something better, was the actual work. Not the presentations, not the milestone moments. The grinding, specific, honest work of building a thing that was actually good. He told Lily about the opening date while she was doing homework. Marine biology had given way temporarily to a dinosaur phase, though Mason suspected the horses were still in the wings. The 1st of October, she said. Saturday. Yeah. She looked up from her worksheet. That's almost exactly 1 year from the bank thing. He looked at her. You know when the bank thing was? October 7th, she said. I know because it was the week of the fall potluck, and you forgot to sign up, and you brought the rolls. He stared at her for a moment. How do you remember that? I remember most things, she said, with the casual accuracy of someone who has known this about themselves for some time and doesn't consider it remarkable. Can I come to the opening? I was going to ask you, he said. She went back to her worksheet. Good, she said. I want to see the building. The building, by the last week of September, was done. Falk had delivered on the 22nd as promised, and the punch list had been genuinely short. 3 items, all minor, all resolved within 48 hours. Mason did a walkthrough alone on a Thursday evening after everyone else had gone, moving through the training rooms and the corridor and the central gathering space that connected everything, in the particular quiet of a building that was finished and waiting. He'd been in buildings that were waiting before. That was its own specific feeling, so not emptiness, but potential, the weight of everything that was about to happen in a space without any of it having happened yet. He stood in the main training hall for a while, in the warm, neutral light, on the wood composite floor, and he thought about October and carpet and the smell of cleaning solution and a plastic chair leg under his hand. He thought about a hallway lit red and the sound of an alarm that had taken on its own life. He thought about sitting on a curb with a paper cup of bad coffee while the building behind him got processed by people whose job it was to understand what had just happened. He thought about the fact that something had started that morning that he hadn't been looking for and hadn't expected, and that it had led, through a series of specific and improbable steps, to this building and this floor and this work and the 14 people who showed up every morning to try to make it real. He didn't have a tidy way to think about that. He wasn't sure he needed one. He turned off the lights and locked up and drove home to check on Lily, who was asleep with a dinosaur book open on her chest, and he moved it to the nightstand with the same care he always did. The opening day arrived the way significant days always do, with the same requirements as all the others. Mason was up at 5:30. He made coffee. He reviewed his remarks, which were short because he wasn't the feature of the day and didn't want to be. He made Lily pancakes because it was Saturday, and Saturday was pancakes, and she ate them with the methodical focus she brought to food she liked. And then she put on the dress she'd chosen herself, dark blue, with small white flowers, which she'd hung on the back of her door 3 days ago in preparation, and declared herself ready. You look nice, he said. I know, she said. You should change your shirt. He looked down at his shirt. What's wrong with it? It's the same one you wear to the warehouse. I don't work at the warehouse anymore. I know, but it looks like you do, she said, with the gentle brutality of someone who loves you and has no reason to soften accurate observations. He changed his shirt. Carla met them at the building at 9:15, arriving with the specific energy she always brought to events she'd dressed up for, which meant she'd dressed up. A blazer, earrings, the deliberate effort of someone who took the significance of occasions seriously. She hugged Mason, held him for a second longer than necessary, then released him and looked at the building's exterior. This is real, she said. Yeah, he said. She looked at him. Are you okay? Carla. I'm asking. I'm good, he said, and meant it more completely than he usually did when he said it. She held his gaze for a moment the way she'd been doing since they were children. The older sister inspection, looking for the thing he wasn't saying. Whatever she found, she seemed satisfied with. She put her arm around Lily, and the 3 of them walked in. The gathering space was filling. Diane had organized the guest list with the same operational precision she brought to everything. Survivors from the pilot sessions, community center participants including Dottie, who arrived early and immediately claimed a chair near the front with the proprietary confidence of someone who knew she belonged in the front. First responders from 3 departments who'd been consultants on the curriculum design, board members, the 7 partner organizations representatives, and a small contingent of people Mason didn't recognize who turned out to be former colleagues of Gross's from FEMA who'd come because Gross had told them about the program, and Gross, it emerged, was a more effective evangelist than anyone had expected from a man who still maintained a professionally skeptical expression at all times. Gross was in the corner when Mason found him, drinking coffee and looking around the room with the expression of someone doing a continuous quality assessment. "Well," Mason said. "Room acoustics are better than I expected," Gross said. "That's the only thing you're going to say." Gross looked at him. "You built something real," he said. "You already know that. You don't need me to tell you." "I'm not asking for validation." "You're asking what I think," Gross said. "I think it's real, and I think it's going to help people. And I think you should stop standing here talking to me and go find Evelyn, because she's been doing the hostess thing for an hour, and she looks like she needs someone in her corner." Mason looked across the room. Evelyn was near the entrance, moving between conversations with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. But Gross was right. There was something beneath the ease, a tightness in the jaw, a quality of operating just above her actual energy level. He made his way across the room. She saw him coming, and something in her face shifted, not dramatically, just the small adjustment of a person who has spotted the one face in a crowded room that doesn't require anything from them. "How are you doing?" he said. "I've talked to 47 people in the last hour," she said. "My face is tired." "Your face looks fine." "My face is performing," she said. "It's different." He stood beside her rather than across from her, both of them looking at the room. "Diane's handling the program rundown," he said. "You don't need to manage the logistics." "I know," she said. "I'm not managing the logistics. I'm just—" She paused. "I've launched things before. Funds, acquisitions, initiatives. I know what this moment usually feels like." "What does it usually feel like?" "Like the work is done and now it's about the presentation of the work," she said. "That's what a launch usually is. The work is finished. You're celebrating it. And this is different. This feels like the work is just starting," she said. "Which I know is true, but it also makes the opening feel heavier than a celebration," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Yes. That's because you care about what it does, not what it looks like," he said. "That's not a problem. That's the point." She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the room continued its gathering momentum conversation, the noise level rising as more people arrived, the specific energy of a room filling with people who have a reason to be there and know it. "I keep thinking about the bank," she said. Not in a distressing way. More like I can't fully separate that morning from any of this. From the building, the work, you." She paused. "I'm aware that's probably obvious." "It's not obvious," he said. "Or maybe the connection is obvious, but what it means isn't." "What does it mean? To you?" He thought about it honestly. "I think some things that start badly can become something else without that change being naive," he said. "You don't have to pretend the beginning was good, but you also don't have to let the beginning define the whole thing." She looked at him for a moment. "That's the most I've heard you say about it in a year." "I've been working up to it," he said. She laughed. The real one, the one that broke through the precision. A few people nearby looked over briefly and looked away. "Thank you," she said. And then, with the same quality of directness she'd always had, from a rain-wet sidewalk outside a coffee shop, to a 14-floor boardroom, to here. "For everything. Not just today. All of it. We built it together," he said. "We did," she said. "But you walked into a hallway with 2 armed men because you were paying attention when nobody else was. That's where it started. I haven't forgotten that." He looked at her. "I didn't do it for this." "I know," she said. "That's what makes it matter." Diane called the room to order at 10 o'clock, and the formal portion of the opening began. She spoke first, clearly and without ceremony, outlining what the center was and what it was intended to do, and she did it in the language of the work itself rather than the language of announcement, which was exactly right. Gross spoke briefly, very briefly, 4 minutes, which, for Gross, represented a significant emotional investment. Bain spoke about the curriculum design with the animated, specific affection of someone describing work they genuinely loved. Then Evelyn spoke. She talked about the gap they were filling, not in policy language, not in the language of a boardroom presentation, but in the language of a person who had been on a bank floor in October and understood in the most concrete possible way what it meant to be in a dangerous situation without any framework for what to do. She didn't perform the vulnerability. She just stated it plainly, the way she stated most things, and the plainness of it was what made the room go quiet in a particular way. The person who changed the course of that morning, she said, is someone I would describe as the opposite of what we're usually taught to look for. He wasn't the loudest person in the room. He didn't announce himself. He was a 32-year-old single father who came to the bank to transfer his daughter's school tuition and ended up making calculations about people, about space, about risk that most people never have to make, and that he made with a steadiness that I still find, a year later, genuinely difficult to account for. She paused. He would tell you it wasn't heroism, she said. He would tell you it was training and circumstance and a particular combination of capabilities he'd developed over years. And he'd be right, which is exactly the argument for what we're building here. Because what if more people had that training? Not the same training, not Navy SEAL training, not anything that requires years of specialized preparation, but the underlying structure of it, the ability to assess a situation, the ability to make one decision when everything says there are no good decisions, the ability to stay useful when everything around you is going wrong. She looked at the room. That's what we're here to teach, she said, and I think it's worth doing. She sat down. The room responded with the kind of silence that precedes applause when the applause is genuine rather than reflexive. Lily, sitting between Mason and Carla in the second row, leaned against Mason's arm and said, in a whisper that was only partially a whisper, "She talked about you." "I know," he said, also quietly. "You're going red," Lily observed. "I'm not." "A little," she said. Carla, on Lily's other side, appeared to be looking extremely carefully at something on the wall. He was, in fact, a little red. He didn't address this further. Mason spoke last and briefly. "Us." He talked about what he'd seen in the pilot sessions. Not the design of them, not the data, but the specific moments that had stayed with him. The woman in scrubs whose hands had stopped shaking when someone held her gaze. The insurance company group finding their way to honesty in the afternoon session after a morning of performing competence. Dottie, who had already invented a protocol under pressure because she'd had no other option, and who deserved to know that what she'd done had a name and a framework, and that other people could learn it before the power went out. "The thing I've spent a year trying to build into this program," he said, "isn't a skill set. It's a permission structure. Permission to not know what to do at the start, because not knowing what to do at the start is the accurate response to most crisis situations. And the people who pretend otherwise are the ones who make it worse. What we're trying to give people is a framework for what comes after not knowing. The specific, manageable next step that you can actually take with the information you actually have." He looked at the room. "One step," he said. "That's all it is. Find one person and make sure they're okay. Identify one exit. Make one decision with the information you have. Not the perfect decision, not the complete solution. One thing, and then the next one." He paused. "Most of us can do that. We just don't know we can until someone shows us." He sat down. Lily patted his hand once, matter-of-factly, and went back to looking at the room. The rest of the morning opened into something that didn't have a formal name. Not a reception, not a tour, just people moving through the space and having the kinds of conversations that happen when a room full of people who care about the same problem finally find themselves in the same physical location. Mason moved through it without agenda, talking to people when conversations found him, watching the space function the way he'd imagined it functioning for months. Dottie found him near the main training hall doorway. She was in a yellow dress and sensible shoes, and she looked at him with the direct, unsentimental appraisal she brought to everything. "I watched you speak," she said. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I came because I wanted to see what you built," she said. "And because that woman," she gestured toward Evelyn, "called me personally to invite me, which I appreciated." She looked around the training hall. "It's a good room," she said. "Plenty of space, not too cold. The lighting isn't offensive." "High praise," Mason said. "It's accurate praise," she said. "I don't give compliments I don't mean." She looked at him. "You going to be teaching in here?" When the program runs, yes. You're good at it, she said. That session in March, you have the quality of someone who's actually in the room with you, not reading from a thing in your head. I appreciate that, he said. I'm not complimenting you, she said. I'm telling you what I observed. She paused. It's different. I understand the distinction, he said. She nodded once, satisfied, and moved on into the room. He watched her go and thought that Dottie was one of the more useful people he'd encountered in the past year, which was a category that had become more populated than he'd expected. Carla found him later near the coffee setup, while Lily was involved in a conversation with one of Diane's staff members about. He couldn't hear the specific content, but he could see the hand gestures, which suggested dinosaurs. It's really something, Carla said. She had a coffee in both hands, the gesture of someone settling in for a real conversation. Yeah, he said. How do you feel? You and Lily are the only people who ask me that directly, he said. That's because we're the only ones you've known long enough to earn the right to ignore the answer, she said. How do you feel? He looked at the room. At Lily, who had apparently won some argument about dinosaurs judging by her expression. At Gross in the corner, talking to one of his FEMA contacts with what appeared to be for Gross, genuine enthusiasm. At Diane moving through the room with the competent ease of someone who belonged at the center of things and knew it. At Baines, laughing at something one of the partner organization representatives had said, her legal pad abandoned for once. At Evelyn, across the room, listening to something Dottie was saying with the quality of attention she gave everything, real attention, not performed attention, and nodding at something, and then saying something that made Dottie's expression shift from assessment to something warmer. I feel like it was worth it, he said. Carla looked at him for a long moment. That's not a feeling, she said. That's a conclusion. They're the same thing for me sometimes, he said. She squeezed his arm once and let it go. It's worth it, she said. For the record, from someone who's been watching. She looked across the room to where Evelyn was still talking with Dottie. She's good, she said, meaning Evelyn. I've been watching her all morning. She's... Yes, he said. That's all you're going to say? We work together, Carla. You also eat lunch together 3 times a week, she said. Derek told me. He mentioned it when I called to confirm the invitation. Derek talks too much. Derek is perceptive, she said. There's a difference. He didn't answer this, which Carla accepted with the patience of someone who had been not answered by the same person for 30-odd years, and had learned that silence was its own kind of communication. The formal part of the day wound down around noon. People moved toward the catering setup that Diane had organized. Good food, not extravagant food, the right call, and the room loosened into the informal rhythm of people eating and talking without agenda. The October light was doing something honest and unhurried through the east-facing windows of room 3. The door propped open, the warm tone of the walls catching it in a way that made the space look like it had been there a long time already. Mason stepped outside for 10 minutes into the October air. The street was quiet at this end of the Alderton block. A few parked cars, the transit hub visible a block north, a couple walking past with a dog who was urgently interested in something near the building's foundation. He stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets and breathed the specific October air, which smelled like fallen leaves and the distant possibility of rain and the season turning over into whatever was next. He heard the door behind him. He didn't turn around. He knew the sound of her footsteps well enough by now. Not because he'd been paying particular attention, but because you learn the specific rhythms of the people you spend significant time with, the way they move through spaces without deciding to learn them. Evelyn stood beside him on the sidewalk. She'd taken off her jacket at some point. The October air was cool enough that she'd put it back on, partially, one arm in and one draped over her shoulder, which was the first time he'd seen her in anything other than full deliberate composure in a public space. She looked at the street. You needed air, she said. It wasn't a question. 10 minutes, he said. They stood in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had run out of things they needed to say to each other and were fine with that. The dog down the street had resolved its investigation of the foundation and was now proceeding up the block with its owners, satisfied. A bus went past at the end of the street, the transit hub doing its indifferent business. A year ago I was signing papers at the credit union on Route 7, he said, after the police released me. What papers? School tuition. For Lily. That's why I was at First Meridian, the transfer. She looked at him. Did it go through? Yeah, eventually. Everything for 1 year of school tuition, she said, and then everything after. That's how it usually goes, he said. You're doing one specific ordinary thing, and the world has different plans. She was quiet for a moment. Do you think it would have happened differently if they'd come in 10 minutes later when you'd already been to the teller? If you'd been walking out? I've thought about it, he said. I don't know. Probably I would have seen them coming in when I was going out. And I would have assessed the situation and made a decision, he said, but it would have been a different set of options. Different outcome. Maybe, he said. I don't spend a lot of time on the maybe versions. She nodded slowly. I do, she said. I run scenarios, backward and forward. She paused. It's usually useful professionally and not very useful personally. He looked at her sideways. What's the scenario you run backward from this? She met his gaze. In the October light, without the architecture of a boardroom or the structure of a meeting, she looked exactly like what she was. A person who had built significant things and carried the weight of them and was tired sometimes and didn't say so enough, and who had walked into a bank on an ordinary Tuesday and walked out with something she hadn't been looking for. I think about the floor, she said, lying on that carpet, watching you be completely still and knowing, not guessing, knowing that you were doing something, that it wasn't paralysis, that you were calculating. She paused. I'd never seen anyone do that in real time, in actual danger, and I thought, whoever this person is, there's something there I don't have language for yet. And now, he said. Now I have language, she said. She stopped. Started again. I spend a lot of time being precise about things. It's useful. It's also occasionally a way of keeping things at a distance that I've decided I'm comfortable with. He waited. I'm not comfortable with distance from this, she said. She stopped again, and for the first time in a year he watched her not have the right words immediately, which was its own kind of information. From you, she said. From whatever this is. I'm aware we haven't... No, he said. We haven't. Is that something you'd want to change? She asked. She asked it directly, the same way she asked everything that mattered, without hedging or pre-softening it. It was one of the things about her that had made him trust her faster than he trusted most people. He looked at the street, the transit hub, the dog and its people, now a block away. The October sky, which was doing what October skies did, making everything look a little more significant than it actually was, and also exactly as significant as it actually was. I have a 7-year-old, he said, who already has opinions about you and hasn't met you. What kind of opinions? Favorable ones, he said. She thinks you make the complicated feeling better. Evelyn blinked. The complicated feeling. I'll explain that another time, he said. The point is, yes, I'd want to change it. I just want to be careful about what I'm changing and how, because there's a person inside who matters more than anything else I'm trying to build. Lily, she said. Yeah. I know, she said. I've always known that. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to choose. I'm asking if there's room. He thought about the stripe of hall light under Lily's door, the dinosaur book on the nightstand, the horses on every surface, her eating her own lunch and coming home to tell him about it with satisfaction, the way she'd patted his hand at the end of his remarks once, matter-of-factly. Does the lady from the bank make it better? The complicated feeling. Yeah, he said. There's room. She exhaled. The same small sound he'd heard in the elevator after the board vote, the real sound beneath the composed exterior. She looked at the street for a moment. Okay, she said, quietly. Okay, he said. They stood on the sidewalk a little longer, in the October air, not touching, not performing anything, just standing in the specific weight of a moment that had finally caught up with all the smaller moments that had been building toward it for a year. It wasn't romantic in any constructed sense. It was just true. And true was better. Inside, he could hear the muffled sounds of the gathering, Conversation, laughter, the specific sound of a room full of people who have found a common purpose and are glad to be in the same place. 14 staff members, 7 partner organizations, 31 community center participants who'd been through the pilot, 42 insurance employees, many of whom had gone back to their teams and described what the session had changed about how they thought. Dottie, who invented protocols under pressure and deserved to know they had names. Gross, who didn't give approval easily and had given it here. Baines, who'd pushed back on 17 things and made all 17 of them better. And somewhere in there, Lily, in her dark blue dress with white flowers, probably still discussing dinosaurs with someone who now knew considerably more about the Cretaceous period than they had an hour ago. "We should go back in," Evelyn said. "Yeah," he said. Neither of them moved for another moment. Then she turned toward the door, and he held it open, and they went back inside together. The first full program cycle launched 3 weeks later, in November, with 46 participants across 2 cohorts. The insurance company's second round and a new corporate partner, plus a returning group from the community center and a new cohort from a neighborhood school's parent organization. Mason ran the first session himself, in the main training hall, in the warm neutral light on the wood composite floor. He started the way he always started now, not with a slide, not with a protocol, not with data. He asked a question. "Tell me about a time something went wrong," he said, "and you didn't know what to do." The room was quiet for a moment. Then, one by one, people started talking. A woman who'd been in a car accident on the highway at night and frozen. A man who'd been present when a coworker collapsed and couldn't remember the first aid he'd been trained in 3 years before. A teenager, one of the school program participants, 16, in the back row, who started speaking quietly and got louder as he went, who'd been caught in a crowd incident at a street festival and had run the wrong direction because he panicked and then felt ashamed about it for months. Mason listened to each of them. He didn't offer solutions. He didn't tell them they'd been wrong. He just listened and let the room hear itself, and waited until the last voice had settled. "None of that is failure," he said. "What you just described is what untrained people do in trained for situations. It's the appropriate response given the preparation you had." He paused. "The question is what changes with a different kind of preparation, and that's what we're here to find out together." The room had that quality again, the listening quiet. He'd come to understand that this was the moment the work actually started, not when the curriculum began, when the room decided it was safe to be uncertain. He kept going. Outside the east-facing windows, the November morning was gray and honest, the city doing what it always did, indifferent and continuous, moving through the particular work of an ordinary day. Inside the room, 46 people who had never met each other 2 hours ago were beginning, slowly, to understand something about themselves that they hadn't known before they walked through the door. It was not a large thing in the scale of the world's problems. Mason knew that. He'd spent 11 years in contexts where the scale of problems was measured in ways that made a training room seem modest. But he'd also spent those 11 years learning that scale wasn't the point. The point was the specific person in front of you, in the specific moment you had, making the one decision that was available to them. The woman in scrubs whose hands stopped shaking. The retired schoolteacher who'd already found the protocol before anyone told her it existed. The 16-year-old in the back row who'd been ashamed for months of a response that was simply human. You couldn't save everyone from everything. You couldn't eliminate the situations that required courage from people who hadn't prepared for courage. But you could hand someone a framework and say, "Here, this is what the next step looks like. You can do this." Not because you're exceptional, but because you're a person, and persons are more capable than they know. And the distance between what you think you can do and what you can actually do is smaller than the fear makes it feel. That was the whole argument. That was what the building was for. After the session, he called Lily from the parking lot. She picked up on the third ring. She was at school, in between classes. He could hear the hallway noise behind her, the particular sound of a school in motion. "How was it?" she said. "Good," he said. "Really good." "Did they learn stuff?" "They started to," he said. "That's what the first session is." "When's the next one?" 2 weeks. "Okay," she said. "Dad?" "Yeah." "I told Emma about the center," she said. She wants to know if kids can come someday. When we have a program for kids, yes, he said. We're working on it. Good, she said. Emma's good in emergencies. She's the one who got the teacher when I fell off the monkey bars in second grade. I remember, he said. I got the call. So she'd be good at this stuff, Lily said with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone making a reasonable organizational assessment. She probably would, he said. Okay, I have to go. Love you. Love you, Bug. She hung up. He sat in the Civic for a moment, phone in his hand, the November air outside the windows, the Alderton building solid and quiet behind him, the city doing its work around him in every direction. He thought about a number, 43. The ticket he'd pulled from the dispenser at First Meridian on a Tuesday morning in October, standing in a lobby that was about to become something else, thinking about chicken nuggets and red dye and a 7-year-old's lunchbox, and whether the lunch would make it home uneaten. He'd never made it to the teller window. He'd made it here instead. He started the car. The heater took 8 minutes to warm up. He'd stopped counting the minutes sometime around July, when the drive had become familiar enough that the small discomforts of it had stopped registering as discomforts, and become just the texture of the thing, the ordinary friction of an ordinary life, moving through its specific and unremarkable days toward whatever they were building into. He pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward the school.